What if ancient prophecies weren't myths, but warnings? What if the visions dismissed as superstition were truths unfolding right now? Tonight, we dig into 30 prophecies that seem to be coming true. This isn't coincidence, it's a pattern. Welcome, seekers of the forbidden. If you crave dark history and buried truths, subscribe and drop a comment. Midnight in Manchester, sunrise in Sydney. Let's step into the shadows together. The ancient streets of Rome echo with the clatter of chariots, the murmur of senators plotting in marble halls, the clink of coins in the forum. But beneath all that grandeur, beneath the golden eagles and the victory parades, there's a whisper that says the empire's days are numbered. The Oracle of Delphi had already seen it coming. Here's what we've been told. Rome fell because of internal strife, political corruption, barbarian invasions, the usual suspects of imperial collapse, military overextension, economic decay, lead in the water pipes maybe. The narrative is clean, rational, explainable, but the Oracle of Delphi told a different story, centuries before the first Gothic warrior crossed the Rhine. The priestesses at Delphi, seated above the vapors rising from the earth's belly, spoke of Rome's destruction as divine inevitability. Not just, maybe this empire will decline someday, but specific warnings about dates, events, the nature of the collapse. The prophecies were recorded on scrolls, copied by scribes, preserved in the great library of Alexandria before it burned. And here's where it gets unsettling. When scholars finally translated the surviving fragments, texts that had been dismissed as religious nonsense for centuries, they found something remarkable. The oracle described the splitting of the empire, east and west. She spoke of a great migration from the north that would overwhelm the legions. She even referenced the symbolic significance of 476 CE, though obviously not in our calendar system. Her prediction aligned with celestial events that occurred exactly when Romulus Augustulus, the last Western Roman emperor, was deposed. Not metaphor, not vague symbolism. Specific events matching historical records with disturbing precision. The prophecies weren't just filed away and forgotten either. Roman senators consulted them. Emperors knew about them. There's evidence that some late Roman leaders understood they were living through the exact scenario the oracle had predicted. And yet, they couldn't stop it. Political inertia, military necessity, economic reality, all of it grinding toward the prophesied end. In 408 CE, just before Alaric and the Visigoths sacked Rome, a delegation visited what remained of the Delphic oracle site. The priestess was gone, the sanctuary was crumbling, but carved into the stone, one of the last inscriptions read, "The eagle falls when the shepherds abandon the flock." Within 2 years, Rome burned. The official narrative says prophecy had nothing to do with Rome's fall. It was all political, economic, military. But the evidence suggests that the Romans themselves believed they were living through a prophecy. And when you believe in inevitability, when you see your fate already written, how hard do you really fight against it? The Oracle of Delphi saw Rome's end written in the stars and in the earth's breath. She told them, they knew. And still, it happened exactly as she said. Beneath the shadow of the pyramids, in the dim corridors of temples older than memory, the priests of Egypt whispered warnings. Not about seasonal flooding, they were talking about something far worse. The admonitions of Ipuwer, a papyrus dating to around 1850 BCE, describes a catastrophic period when the river is blood and the land turns upside down. For a long time, scholars dismissed this as poetic exaggeration, but recent climate research tells a different story. Core samples taken from the Nile Delta reveal evidence of massive, catastrophic flooding events that occurred cyclically throughout Egypt's history. Not the gentle, predictable inundation, devastating floods that wiped out entire settlements, destroyed temples, forced mass migrations. And these floods correlate eerily with the timeline suggested by ancient Egyptian prophecies. The priests spoke of these events as divinely ordained cleansings, times when the gods would wash away the corruption and force humanity to begin again. The prophecies describe cities swallowed by water, the fertile lands turned to marsh, the migration of peoples to higher ground. In the Prophecy of Neferti, another ancient Egyptian text, a sage predicts that The land is completely perished, no remainder exists. He describes the Nile running dry in some places while flooding catastrophically in others, a scenario that doesn't match the normal seasonal pattern at all. And here's what makes this genuinely unsettling. Modern climate data shows that Egypt experienced extreme climate instability during the exact periods these prophecies describe. The African humid period, when the Sahara was green and full of lakes, ended around 5,000 years ago, with devastating speed. Within a few centuries, the entire climate system shifted. The Egyptians lived through it, and they wrote it down, not as history, but as prophecy. Because it kept happening, every few hundred years, the climate would destabilize. The Nile would become unpredictable, famine would follow, dynasties would collapse. Then, slowly, things would restabilize until the next cycle. The priests knew, they'd seen the records, they'd read the old texts. They understood that this wasn't random chaos. It was a pattern, a cycle of destruction and renewal that had played out since before the pyramids were built. In the tomb of Sidi the Wain, there's an inscription that translates roughly to, "The water remembers what men forget." The archaeological evidence suggests they were right. Today, as climate scientists warn about rising sea levels, extreme weather events, and the destabilization of ancient climate patterns, it's worth noting that the Egyptians saw this before. They predicted it. They wrote it down in their sacred texts. They called it the Great Deluge. We call it climate change. The words are different. The water doesn't care. December the 21st, 2012. You remember the panic, right? The doomsday preppers, the conspiracy theories, the History Channel specials. When midnight came and went without incident, everyone laughed it off. Another failed apocalypse prophecy. But here's the thing. The Maya never said the world would end. We did. The long count calendar, developed by the Maya around 500 BCE, is one of the most sophisticated timekeeping systems ever created. December 21st, 2012, marked the end of the 13th Baktun, a complete cycle of roughly 5,125 years. The Maya never called this the end. They called it a transition, a shift from one world age to another. In their cosmology, we've already lived through 4 world ages, each ending not in annihilation, but in transformation. So, what did the Maya actually predict for 2012? According to recently translated hieroglyphs from Tortuguero Monument 6, the date marks, the descent of the 9 support gods. In Maya cosmology, this doesn't mean destruction. It means a shift in the spiritual and cosmic order, a rebalancing, a transition to a new phase of human development. And honestly, look around. 2012 wasn't the end of the world, but it might have been the beginning of something else. The year marked a turning point in multiple global trends that have only accelerated since. Climate awareness went mainstream, social media fundamentally altered human communication, political polarization intensified, technological advancement accelerated beyond predictions. The Arab Spring had erupted in 2011. By 2012, the old order in the Middle East was collapsing. Occupy Wall Street had challenged economic power structures. Climate scientists now identify 2012-2015 as the period when certain tipping points in global warming became irreversible. The Arctic ice reached record lows. Extreme weather events increased in frequency and severity. The Maya also predicted this transformation wouldn't be instant. It would unfold over time. The New World Age doesn't arrive with a bang. It emerges gradually, like dawn. Recent analysis of the Maya Dresden Codex reveals astronomical calculations that extend far beyond 2012. The Maya were tracking celestial cycles thousands of years into the future. They knew the calendar didn't end. It reset, like a cosmic odometer rolling back to zero before continuing. But here's what makes the 2012 prophecy genuinely eerie. The Maya explicitly connected this transition with environmental upheaval. The end of the previous world age, they said, came through drought and ecological collapse, which is exactly what archaeological evidence shows destroyed the classic Maya civilization around 900 CE. They lived through their own prophecy once already. In the ruins of Palenque, there's an inscription that roughly translates to, "When the cycle completes, water and fire will remake the world." The inscription is dated to 683 CE. At 1,029 years before 2012. They knew their own civilization would fall. They recorded it. And then they predicted it would happen again, on a global scale, when the 13th Baktun ended. We're living in their after. So far, they're not wrong. The flickering candlelight casts long shadows across the study. The year is 1555. Michel de Nostradamus, sits hunched over his desk in Salon de Provence, writing in quatrains, mixing French, Latin, Greek, and intentional obscurity. He's not trying to be clear, he's trying to survive. Prophesying the future in 16th century France could get you burned as a heretic. So Nostradamus wrote his predictions in riddles, cryptic enough to avoid the Inquisition, specific enough to be unsettling. For centuries, skeptics have pointed out that Nostradamus's quatrains are so vague they can be retrofitted to any major event. But then there are the ones that don't fit that explanation. Century 2, Quatrain 24, written in 1555. Beasts ferocious with hunger will cross the rivers. The greater part of the battlefield will be against Heister. Into a cage of iron will the great one be drawn, when the child of Germany observes nothing. For 400 years, nobody knew what Heister meant. Then Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany. Heister, Hitler. One letter off, and Nostradamus wasn't writing in German. Beasts ferocious with hunger will cross the rivers. German tanks rolling across Europe. Into a cage of iron will the great one be drawn. The Führer bunker, century the Farspad, Quatrain 87. Earth-shaking fire from the center of the earth will cause tremors around the new city. New city, often interpreted as New York. Earth-shaking fire from the center of the earth, causing tremors. Aircraft striking the Twin Towers, written in 1555, 446 years before September 11th, 2001. The problem with Nostradamus isn't that he's always wrong. It's that he's right often enough to be disturbing. In 1792, during the French Revolution, a mob stormed his tomb, believing he'd hidden gold there. According to local accounts, they found a medallion around his skeleton's neck, inscribed with 1792, Century 9, Quatrain 20 describes, with remarkable precision, the flight of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette through the forest to Varennes in 1791, where they were captured, written 236 years before it happened. Could Nostradamus simply have understood political patterns? Was he a student of history who recognized that power corrupts, empires fall, and humans repeat the same mistakes? Perhaps. But that doesn't explain the specificity, the names, the places, the dates that align when you decode his astronomical references. In Century X, Quatrain 72, Nostradamus writes about the year 1999, 7th month, when a great king of terror will come from the sky. Nothing obviously apocalyptic happened in July 1999, except in August 1999, Vladimir Putin became Prime Minister of Russia, beginning his rise to power. Nostradamus never claimed to understand his own visions. He said he saw them as if in a brass mirror, darkly, fragmented, confusing, out of sequence. He spent his nights staring into bowls of water, inducing trance states, writing down what he saw, without fully comprehending it. The last thing he predicted? His own death. He wrote a note to his assistant on July 1st, 1566. Tomorrow, at sunrise, I shall no longer be here. The next morning, they found him dead beside his desk, ink still wet on his final prophecy, one that hasn't come to pass yet. But at the rate we're going, maybe we're closer than we think. The thick scent of ancient incense swirls through the cathedral. Outside, the world churns with war, disease, political upheaval. Inside, someone opens the book of Revelation and reads words written nearly 2,000 years ago, and the words described today. Revelation was written by John of Patmos around 95 CE. For 2 millennia, every generation of Christians has believed they were living in the end times. Every generation was wrong. Or were they? Let's look at the checklist for our current era. Wars and rumors of wars. According to the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, there are currently more active armed conflicts globally than at any point since 1946. Ukraine, Syria, Yemen, Myanmar, Ethiopia, Sudan, Gaza. Pestilence and plagues. COVID-19 killed over 7 million people globally. We've seen mpox outbreaks, antibiotic-resistant bacteria, bird flu mutations. The WHO warns that the next pandemic isn't an if, but a when. Famines. The UN estimates 345 million people face acute food insecurity in 2024, more than double the number from before the pandemic. Earthquakes in various places, major earthquakes in Turkey, Syria, Morocco, Afghanistan in just the last few years, each killing thousands. The sun, moon, and stars will be darkened. Earth experienced the strongest solar storm in years in November 2023, disrupting GPS and communications. The sea roaring in waves. Tossing, sea levels are rising, hurricanes are intensifying. The Pacific Islands are literally disappearing. False prophets and deception, misinformation, deep fakes, AI-generated content, political demagogues claiming divine mandate. The information ecosystem is more polluted with false prophecy than at any point in human history. The love of many will grow cold. Social cohesion is fracturing. Political polarization has people viewing their neighbors as enemies. But here's where it gets specific. Revelation 13 describes a beast that requires everyone to receive a mark without which they cannot buy or sell. For centuries, this seemed like fantasy. Then came biometric identification, facial recognition, digital payment systems, China's social credit system. The infrastructure for what Revelation describes, an economic system where participation requires submission to a centralized authority with the ability to track and control all transactions. That infrastructure exists now. For the first time in human history, it's technologically possible. Revelation 9:16 describes an army of 200 million soldiers from the east. When John wrote this in 95 CE, there weren't 200 million people in the entire Roman Empire. Today, China has over 1.4 billion people and the world's largest standing army. But here's the question. Is Revelation a prophecy or a pattern? Every empire thinks it's the last empire. Every crisis feels like the final crisis. Maybe Revelation isn't predicting our end times specifically. Maybe it's describing what all end times look like. The recurring pattern of civilizational collapse. In Revelation 21, after all the destruction, John describes a new heaven and new earth, a world remade, purified, transformed. Not annihilation, but renewal. Maybe that's the real prophecy. Not that the world ends, but that it changes, violently, painfully, catastrophically, and something new emerges from the ashes. The prophecy isn't about fate, it's about choice. In the quiet sanctuary of Delphi, perched on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, gases seep up from cracks in the earth. Ethylene, according to modern geological surveys, inducing altered states of consciousness in the priestess seated above them, the Pythia, the oracle, the voice of Apollo. For nearly 1,000 years, the Oracle of Delphi was the most powerful religious authority in the ancient world. Kings, generals, philosophers, they all came seeking guidance. And the Pythia gave it, in cryptic verses that somehow proved accurate with disturbing regularity. The skeptical view, the oracle's predictions were deliberately vague, allowing interpretations that could fit any outcome. But then there's Alexander the Great. In 336 BCE, the young Macedonian king visited Delphi before embarking on his conquest of Persia. He arrived on a day when consultations were forbidden. The Pythia refused to perform the ritual. Alexander, never one for patience, physically dragged the priestess toward the temple. She resisted, finally crying out, "You are invincible, my son." Alexander released her, satisfied. But the Pythia's pronouncement came with a caveat recorded in later accounts. Invincible until you make yourself a god. Alexander conquered an empire stretching from Greece to India. He defeated every army he faced. He was, in fact, militarily invincible. And then, at the height of his power, in Babylon, he demanded divine honors. He wanted to be worshipped as the son of Zeus. Within weeks, he fell ill with a fever. 10 days later, at age 32, he was dead. He demanded godhood. He died. Just as the oracle had warned. She warned Croesus, the wealthy king of Lydia, that if he attacked Persia, a great empire will fall. Croesus assumed she meant the Persian Empire. He attacked. The empire that fell was his own, in 546 BCE, exactly as the oracle had implied, but not said. She told the Athenians before the Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE that their wooden walls would save them. The general Themistocles argued it meant their ships. They built a massive fleet, engaged the Persian navy at Salamis, and won a decisive victory that saved Greece. The oracle was right. In 431 BCE, at the start of the Peloponnesian War, she prophesied that Sparta would win if they fought with all their strength, and that a plague would strike Athens. The Athenians dismissed this as Spartan propaganda. Then the plague hit. Between 430 to 426 BCE, it killed roughly a quarter of Athens' population. Sparta eventually won the war. The oracle was right. In her final recorded prophecy in 362 CE, after the Roman Emperor Julian consulted her, the Pythia gave this response: "Tell the king, the fair-wrought house has fallen. No shelter has Apollo, nor sacred laurel leaves. The fountains are now silent. The voice is stilled. It is finished." She was saying the oracle itself was ending. No more prophecies would come. And she was right. Within a few years, the Temple of Delphi fell into disuse. She even predicted her own end. Recent archaeological research at Delphi has confirmed the presence of ethylene gas emissions from geological faults beneath the temple. But that doesn't explain accuracy. Being high doesn't make you clairvoyant. Maybe the oracle wasn't predicting the future at all. Maybe she was reading patterns in human behavior, seeing the logical outcomes of decisions not yet made, understanding causality with a clarity that comes from being removed from normal consciousness. Or maybe some knowledge isn't about the future at all. Maybe it's about seeing the present clearly enough to know what's inevitable. The Hittite tablets sit in museum collections now, clay fragments covered in cuneiform script, pressed into soft clay 3,000 years ago by scribes who saw what was coming. They wrote about famine, not the normal, occasional bad harvest. They wrote about systemic, civilization-ending crop failure stretching across decades. The Hittites were a major Bronze Age power centered in Anatolia, modern Turkey, from roughly 1600 to 1180 BCE. They fought Egypt to a standstill. They mastered ironworking. They built a sophisticated empire, and then they vanished. The official explanation: the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE destroyed multiple civilizations simultaneously. But the specifics of why the Hittites fell remain mysterious until archaeologists started translating their administrative records. In tablets dating to around 1250 BCE, nearly half a century before the final collapse, Hittite scribes recorded urgent correspondence about grain shipments. The king was importing massive quantities of grain from Egypt, Syria, Canaan. Emergency shipments, relief supplies. Why? Drought, crop failure, famine spreading across Anatolia. But here's what's genuinely eerie. Among the administrative records, archaeologists found ritual texts, prophecies recorded by priests, describing exactly this scenario. Not after the fact, before. One tablet fragment contains a prophecy delivered by a priest to King Muwatalli II, ruled 1295 and 1272 BCE. The prophecy warns of years when the grain does not grow, when the gods withdraw the rain, when the people will abandon the cities and walk toward the setting sun. Mass migration westward, which is exactly what the archaeological evidence shows happened. The prophecy continues: when the gods close their hands, no amount of sacrifice will open them. The years of hunger will not be 2 or 3, but 20. 20 years of famine. Climate data from tree ring analysis, Mediterranean sediment cores, and archaeological evidence confirms that the eastern Mediterranean experienced a severe, prolonged megadrought between approximately 1200 and 1150 BCE, lasting roughly 50 years. The Hittite priests predicted it decades in advance. Another tablet contains a ritual prophecy from around 1200 BCE. The land of Hatti will break like old pottery. The king will flee from the great house. The enemies from the sea will burn what remains. The enemies from the sea, the mysterious sea peoples whose raids devastated multiple Bronze Age civilizations. The Hittite prophecy described them before they arrived. By 1180 BCE, the Hittite Empire had collapsed completely. The capital at Hattusa was burned and abandoned. exactly as the prophecies predicted. Modern climate scientists studying the Bronze Age collapse have identified the mega drought as the primary driver of civilizational collapse across the eastern Mediterranean. This wasn't a random event. It was part of a larger climate cycle, one that recurs on timescales of centuries to millennia. And here's what should concern us. The same climate patterns that caused the Bronze Age megadrought are occurring again right now. The Mediterranean is experiencing sustained drought. Turkey is facing water crises. Syria's civil war was partly triggered by a massive drought from 2006-2011. The Hittite priests saw this pattern 3,000 years ago. They watched the rains fail. They checked their records and realized this had happened before. And they warned their kings. Nobody listened because what can you do against climate change when you don't even have the vocabulary for it? The Hittites couldn't stop it. They couldn't adapt quickly enough. Their civilization couldn't survive. In one of the final tablets from Hadassah, a desperate message from the last Hittite king reads, "There is famine in my land. May you save me." The Hittites kept immaculate records, and among those records, prophecies that predicted their own end. They knew it was coming. They wrote it down, and it happened anyway. The ancient city of Ur, now a silent ruin under the blistering Iraqi sun, once hosted a civilization that knew far more about the future than we gave them credit for. The Sumerians, history's first civilization, emerging around 4500 BCE in Mesopotamia, developed writing, mathematics, astronomy, law codes, and urban planning. And they wrote about the sun killing everything. In clay tablets dating to around 2000 BCE, Sumerian scribes recorded the Lament for Sumer and Ur, a text describing environmental catastrophe. The storm ordered by Enlil in hate, the storm which wears away the land, covered Ur like a cloth. This storm wasn't just military conquest. The text describes ecological devastation, agricultural collapse, fields that no longer produced crops. For a long time, historians assumed this was poetic description of military defeat. But archaeological evidence reveals something more complex: environmental collapse. Soil samples from ancient Sumerian agricultural fields show massive salinization. The irrigation systems that made Mesopotamian agriculture possible had a fatal flaw. Over time, irrigation in hot, arid climates causes salt to accumulate in the soil. Eventually, the land becomes too salty to grow crops. The Sumerians were aware of this. They had records showing declining crop yields over generations. They knew the land was dying. And then there's the heat. Climate reconstructions show that the Middle East experienced significant warming and aridification during the late 3rd millennium BCE, the same period when Sumerian civilization collapsed. But here's where it gets unsettling. The Sumerians predicted this, not in clear scientific terms, but in their mythology and religious texts. There are repeated references to an age of fire or an unforgiving sun that would scorch the earth. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains a passage where the hero crosses a landscape described as unbearably hot, where there is no water, no shade, only burning. Scholars have always read this as mythological journey, but recent analysis suggests it might describe an actual environmental phenomenon, the increasing desertification of Mesopotamia. The Sumerian creation myth describes a cycle of destruction and renewal. After the gods create humanity, they send a series of disasters: plague, drought, and then the flood. Plague and drought before the flood. The Sumerians recorded both, and they understood them as cyclical, not one-time events, but recurring patterns. In administrative texts from the Ur-3 period, there are records of heat damage to crops, of yields declining year after year, of emergency water rationing, of populations migrating away from the hottest regions. These aren't myths, they're economic records. Climate data written in grain shipment receipts. One tablet contains a calculation by a Sumerian scribe estimating how many years the current irrigation system could continue before complete soil failure. His estimate? Approximately 200 years. He was right. Within 180 years, Ur was abandoned. The Sumerian prediction wasn't mystical vision. It was applied observation. They watched their climate change. They measured declining crop yields. They calculated the math. And they realized their civilization had an expiration date. They just couldn't stop it, because stopping it would have required abandoning their entire agricultural system. moving away from the cities they had built, restructuring their economy. The cost of adaptation was higher than their civilization could bear, so they kept irrigating, kept growing barley in increasingly salinized fields, kept expanding their cities even as the environmental foundation crumbled beneath them. And they wrote it all down. Today, the region where Sumer flourished is one of the most vulnerable places on Earth to climate change. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 125 degrees Celsius. Water scarcity is severe. Agricultural land is increasingly unviable. In 2021, the Iraqi government declared water scarcity a national security crisis. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers are flowing at historically low levels. Salt content in agricultural soil is rising. The cycle is repeating. In one of the final texts from Ur, a priest recorded this: "The wise king built cities to last forever, but the sun remembers nothing and respects nothing. When the fire comes, even kings are dust." The Sumerians knew. They warned us across 4,000 years. We're just now learning to read it. Among the windswept northern shores, where the aurora dances green and red across winter skies, Viking skalds spoke of the end, not the end of a world, the end of the world, Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, the final battle when gods, giants, monsters, and men would all perish in ice and flame, when the world tree would shake, when the sun would be devoured, and the seas would rise to drown everything. For 1,000 years, this was dismissed as Viking imagination. But let's look at what Ragnarok actually describes. According to the Voluspa, Ragnarok begins with Fimbulwinter, 3 consecutive years of brutal winter with no summer in between. Snow drives from all quarters. The wind is raw. The sun gives no warmth. Climate scientists call this scenario volcanic winter. What happens when massive volcanic eruptions inject so much ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere that global temperatures drop, crops fail, and populations starve? And it's happened multiple times during the Viking Age. In 536 CE, a massive volcanic eruption caused global temperatures to plummet. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote, "The sun gave forth its light without brightness." The cold lasted 18 months. Crops failed across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Famine followed, then plague, killing millions. And then it happened again. In 536, 540, and 547 CE, multiple massive eruptions within 15 years. Tree ring data shows this period as one of the coldest in the last 2,500 years. This is the lived experience that created Fimbulwinter. But Ragnarok isn't just about cold. The prophecy describes social collapse before the environmental catastrophe. Brothers will fight and kill each other. Sisters' children will defile kinship. It is harsh in the world. An axe age, a sword age. Shields are riven, a wind age, a wolf age, before the world goes headlong. This isn't mythology. This is what happens during severe environmental stress. When crops fail, when resources become scarce, societies fracture, conflict increases, trust breaks down. Archaeological evidence from the migration period shows exactly this pattern across Scandinavia. Abandoned farms, mass graves, evidence of violence, populations migrating away from marginal agricultural lands. The Vikings weren't predicting the future. They were describing the past and recognizing it as a pattern that would repeat. The prophecy continues. After Fimbulwinter, the wolf Fenrir devours the sun. The Midgard serpent rises from the ocean. The fire giant Surtur sets the world ablaze. Strip away the mythological imagery, and you're left with this: astronomical or atmospheric phenomena, oceanic disruption, and fire consuming the landscape. Does this describe climate catastrophe? Ecological collapse? The prophecy ends with most of the gods dead, the world sinking into the sea, fire consuming what remains. But then, critically, the world re-emerges. The earth rises again from the water, green and fertile. A few gods survive. 2 humans, hidden in the world tree, repopulate the earth. This isn't permanent annihilation. It's cyclical destruction and renewal. The Norse understood that civilizations end, climate shifts, resources collapse, populations die. But then, eventually, conditions improve, survivors rebuild. Now, here's what makes Ragnarok relevant today. Climate scientists warn that modern climate change could disrupt the Atlantic meridional, overturning circulation. If Greenland's ice sheet melts too quickly, Europe gets colder, even as the global average temperature rises. A regional Fimbul winter, while the rest of the planet burns. The Norse saw it coming, because they'd seen it before. They knew that some cycles don't break. Some patterns just repeat, over and over, until there's nothing left to destroy, or until something changes. In the shadow of Teotihuacan's Grand Pyramids, Aztec priests tracked Venus across the heavens, counting and calculating. They were waiting for the return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god of wind, wisdom, and the morning star. According to prophecy, Quetzalcoatl would return during a one-reed year, which occurred every 52 years in their calendar system. His return would mark great upheaval and the end of one world age. The year 1519 was a one-reed year, and in 1519, Hernán Cortés arrived. The official story claims Moctezuma II mistook Cortés for the returning god, allowing a few hundred Spanish to destroy an empire of millions. But the truth is darker and stranger. The Aztec calendar encoded cyclical time, astronomical patterns, and prophecy. The 52-year calendar round aligned both the 260-day ritual calendar and the 365-day solar calendar. When a cycle ended, the Aztecs performed the new fire ceremony, extinguishing all fires and relighting them. If the ceremony failed, they believed the sun wouldn't rise again. The prophecy wasn't just about a god returning, it was about fundamental transformation of their world order, and they were right. The Spanish brought disease that killed 90% of the population, a new religion replacing their gods, and technologies that utterly erased the old world. From the Aztec perspective, their world literally ended. But was this prophecy or pattern recognition? Aztec traditions described earlier cycles of destruction. They believed they lived in the fifth sun, the fifth world age. The first four ended in catastrophe. Strip away mythology and you're describing environmental threats, climate disasters, volcanic eruptions, flooding. The Aztecs understood that civilizations collapse. They'd seen Teotihuacan's ruins, absorbed the fallen Toltecs. They knew dominance is temporary. Modern analysis reveals even more specific predictions. The Codex Borbonicus contains astronomical calculations tracking Venus cycles. In 1519, Venus appeared as the morning star, Quetzalcoatl's specific aspect, during a one-reed year. This rare configuration was considered highly significant. Aztec priests would have known this was coming for decades. When Cortés arrived from the east, Quetzalcoatl departed eastward in a one-reed year during the right Venus cycle. With pale skin, Quetzalcoatl was described as light-skinned. The priests didn't mistake him for a god through ignorance. They recognized a pattern matching their prophecy. Whether Cortés was actually Quetzalcoatl was irrelevant. The conditions for transformation were aligned. Moctezuma's response wasn't superstitious confusion. It was calculated navigation of a prophesied crisis. In the Florentine Codex, Moctezuma tells his advisors, "We have already arrived at the place of ending." He knew. The prophecy hadn't given them a way to prevent transformation, just recognition that it was coming. This connects to today. The Aztec concept of cyclical time mirrors what historians call world system transitions, periods when dominant global orders collapse and reconfigure. The Bronze Age collapse, Rome's fall, feudalism's end, colonialism, the Cold War's conclusion. These aren't random. They're transitions so fundamental that basic rules shift. We're potentially living through another one now. The post-Vibhusian order is fracturing. Climate change forces global recalibration. Technology restructures human interaction. Power shifts from west to east. Old certainties, American hegemony, dollar dominance, liberal democracy's spread, are no longer certain. The Aztecs recognize these transformations are cyclical and inevitable. Empires rise and fall. New powers emerge. Old gods are replaced. The prophecy wasn't about specific gods or the Spanish specifically. It was about recognizing systemic transformation signs and understanding that resistance is futile. The only option is adaptation. The Aztecs didn't survive as an empire, but aspects of their culture, language, and knowledge did. They adapted. They merged with the new system. In Cholula's temple, an inscription survived. The serpent sheds its skin, but remains the serpent. Transformation isn't death, it's change. The Aztecs prophesied their world's end. They were right, but something survived. Something always does. The question is, what? Beneath vast Chinese skies, sages cast yarrow stalks, consulting the I Ching, the Book of Changes, seeking guidance from patterns older than writing itself. The I Ching isn't a book of prophecies in the Western sense. It's a system of understanding change, recognizing patterns in time's flow. 64 hexagrams, each composed of 6 lines, represent different transformation states. Everything flows, everything changes. Chinese dynasties used the I Ching for strategic decisions. Emperors consulted it, military commanders timed campaigns with it. Philosophers meditated on its wisdom. Embedded within its structure is a pattern of imperial rise and fall that has repeated for over 2,000 years. Consider hexagram 23, foe, splitting apart. The dark lines are about to mount and overthrow the last firm, light line, by exerting a disintegrating influence on it. This describes how empires decay, not through dramatic conquest, but slow internal rot. Corruption spreads, institutions weaken, the center cannot hold. Every Chinese dynasty followed this pattern. The Han, Tang, Song, Ming, Qing all experienced similar trajectories: founding vigor, territorial expansion, cultural flowering, administrative sclerosis, corruption, rebellion, collapse. The I Ching doesn't predict the future. It recognizes that certain conditions lead to certain outcomes. But the cycle doesn't end. Hexagram 24, which follows, is Fu, return. After a time of decay comes the turning point. The powerful light that has been banished returns. Collapse leads to renewal. Chinese history demonstrates this with eerie precision. Every dynasty lasted roughly 250 to 300 years. Every transition involved chaos, warlords, famine, population collapse. And every time, a new dynasty emerged. Hexagram 15, Cheyenne, modesty, warns about success's dangers. Empires at their peak are already beginning their decline. The moment of maximum power is when decay forces become active. Consider the British Empire. At its 1922 height, it controlled nearly a quarter of the world's land and population. Within 25 years, it was dissolving. India gained independence in 1947. By 1970, most colonies were gone. Britain went from global superpower to regional power in less than 50 years. The American century began in 1945 with total dominance. By 2025, 80 years later, American hegemony is contested. China rivals U.S. economic power. The dollar's reserve status is challenged. Military interventions increasingly fail. Political polarization paralyzes governance. The I Ching pattern. When a force reaches maximum expression, the opposite force is already emerging. Western culture believes in progress, linear advancement, permanent victory. We don't think in cycles. We think in trajectories. Always up, always forward. The I Ching laughs at this naivety. Hexagram 36, Ming Boers, darkening of the light, describes civilization entering decline, maintaining integrity during systemic collapse, which is where we are now. Climate crisis, political extremism, social fragmentation, information pollution, economic inequality. Late-stage empire symptoms are everywhere. The I Ching doesn't say this is fixable through policy. It says this is a cycle phase. The old order is darkening, but it's not permanent. Hexagram 24 always follows 23. Return always follows splitting apart. The pattern isn't linear decline into oblivion, it's cyclical transformation. Consider Rome's fall. From the Roman perspective, it was apocalypse, but from broader perspective, it was transformation. The medieval period wasn't darkness, it was reconfiguration. Different power structures, cultural expressions, technologies, but continuous human development. The I Ching predicts Western dominance is ending, not from moral failing, but because that's what empires do. They rise, peak, and transform. China's rise isn't victory over the West. It's the cycle continuing. In 200 years, when Chinese power peaks and begins transforming, that won't be failure either. The only constant is change. In hexagram 02, Kun, the receptive, the I Ching offers wisdom. You can't stop the cycle. You can only navigate it skillfully. Fighting inevitability guarantees failure. Understanding the pattern and adapting allows survival. The I Ching has predicted every major Chinese dynastic transition for 2,500 years. Not through magic, but by encoding observable patterns in human systems. Those patterns are universal. The West is experiencing hexagram 23 splitting apart. What comes next is transformation. Hexagram 24, return. The question isn't whether the old order will end. It's what will build from the pieces. Deep in Mali's desert, the Dogon people have lived for centuries on the Bandiagra escarpment, preserving knowledge passed down through generations of priests and elders. In the 1930s, French anthropologists Marcel Griaule and Germaine Dieterlin lived among the Dogon, earning tribal elders' trust and gradually being initiated into their most sacred knowledge. What they learned defied explanation. The Dogon had detailed astronomical knowledge that shouldn't have been possible without telescopes. Specifically, they knew about Sirius B, a white dwarf companion, star orbiting Sirius A, completely invisible to the naked eye. It wasn't discovered by Western astronomy until 1862, and wasn't photographed until 1970. The Dogon have known about it for at least 400 years, possibly much longer. They call Sirius B Po Tolo. Po refers to the smallest seed known to them, phonio grain. They say it's the smallest, heaviest thing that exists, heavy as all the iron on Earth. White dwarfs are exactly that, incredibly dense stars where matter is compressed so tightly that a teaspoon would weigh tons. The Dogon accurately described a white dwarf's fundamental nature without concepts of atoms or nuclear physics. How? The Dogon say knowledge came from the Nomo, amphibious beings who descended from the sky in an ark amid great noise and fire, bringing wisdom to humanity. According to their oral tradition, the Nomo came from the Sirius system. The skeptical explanation, Griaule and Dieterlin misinterpreted Dogon mythology, or the Dogon learned about Sirius B from Western sources and incorporated it into existing mythology. But Griaule first reported this knowledge in 1946, based on 1930s information. At that time, Western astronomy knew Sirius B existed, but hadn't photographed it or fully understood its nature. The Dogon described its 50-year orbital period, actually of 80.09 years, stunningly accurate, elliptical orbit, and density before Western science confirmed these details. The Dogon also knew Jupiter has moons, Saturn has rings, and planets orbit the sun, not Earth. All encoded in religious ceremonies, sand drawings, sacred dances, traditions predating European contact. Either an isolated African tribe somehow developed advanced astronomical knowledge independently, challenging assumptions about technological progress, or they received this knowledge from an outside source, and if not from Europeans, then from whom? The Dogon are clear. The Nomo, beings from the stars who came to Earth long ago, brought knowledge, then departed. Recent analysis shows their astronomical knowledge is embedded in a complex cosmological system predating the colonial period. It's not simple insertion of Western facts. It's sophisticated, internally consistent worldview, incorporating advanced astronomical concepts. And here's the prophecy. The Dogon say the Nomo will return. Not now, not soon, but when humanity is ready. When we've developed our own technology to the point where we can understand them. Specifically, when humanity discovers how to travel between stars ourselves, they will reach back. Given that we're now seriously discussing interstellar travel, sending probes to Alpha Centauri, theorizing about generation ships, developing faster-than-light travel mathematics, are we approaching the conditions described? In 1995, astronomers confirmed the first exoplanet orbiting a sun-like star. Since then, we've discovered thousands. In 2023, the James Webb Space Telescope began detecting atmospheric compositions on distant worlds, looking for biosignatures, signs of life. We're systematically searching for them now. According to Dogon prophecy, that means they are preparing to reveal themselves. Whether you believe in ancient astronauts or not, the Dogon knowledge of Sirius B remains unexplained. They knew things they shouldn't have been able to know. They preserved that knowledge through oral tradition for centuries. The Dogon prophecy states, when the humans look up and understand the stars, when they reach toward the sky with machines, when they ask, "Are we alone?" the answer will come. In 1960, Frank Drake conducted the first SETI experiment. In 1977, the WOW signal, a strong narrowband radio signal from space lasting 72 seconds, was detected. Source unknown, never repeated, still unexplained. We're not just looking anymore. We're finding things we don't understand. According to Dogon prophecy, that's when the Nomo return. In a ritual ceremony, Dogon priests draw Sirius, Sirius B, orbiting it, and a third point, representing Earth, with lines connecting all three. The link was there, they say. The link is there. The link will be there. Past, present, future. The Noma came from Sirius once. They're still there. And when we're ready, they'll come back. The Dogon have been waiting for 400 years, possibly longer. They're still waiting. Hidden beneath Rome's Temple of Apollo, protected by priests sworn to secrecy, lay the Sibylline books, prophecies so powerful that consulting them required a Senate vote. The legend? Around 600 BCE, a mysterious woman appeared before Tarquinius Superbus, offering to sell him 9 books of prophecy. He refused. She burned 3 and offered him the remaining 6 at the same price. He refused again. She burned 3 more. Finally, alarmed, he purchased the last 3 for the original price of 9. The woman was the Cumaean Sibyl, a prophetess who lived in a cave near Cumae. The 3 surviving books became Rome's most closely guarded state secret, consulted only during national emergencies, plague, famine, military disaster, political crisis. When Hannibal devastated Italy during the Second Punic War, after the catastrophic defeat at Cannae, where 50,000 Romans died, the Senate consulted the Sibylline books. The prophecy prescribed specific religious rituals and, disturbingly, human sacrifice. The Senate, desperate, followed the prescription. Rome eventually won the war. In 133 BCE, the books predicted Rome would face internal political violence and that the traditional republic would eventually fall. The prophecy warned specifically of one-man rule replacing republican government. Within a century, the republic collapsed. Julius Caesar seized power. Augustus became the first emperor. The prophecy had been right. The Sibylline books warned that democracy was inherently unstable. Republics decay into oligarchy, then tyranny. Not might decay, will decay. It's not moral failing, it's pattern. Every republican or democratic system in history has followed this trajectory. Greek city-states, Rome, Italian Renaissance republics, Weimar Germany. And now, modern democracies are experiencing democratic backsliding, gradual erosion of democratic norms and institutions. Hungary has shifted toward authoritarianism under Orban, Turkey under Erdogan. Russia's brief democratic experiment ended with Putin. India's democracy is weakening under Modi. The U.S. experienced an attempted election overthrow on January 6, 2021. Global democracy indexes show declining scores across most regions. Freedom House reports that 2024 marked the 18th consecutive year of global democratic decline. The Sibylline prophecy. Democracy doesn't last. It transforms into oligarchy and then tyranny. Why? Because democracy requires constant vigilance, civic participation, shared values, and institutional strength. It's hard to maintain. Authoritarianism is easier. One person deciding, one vision imposed, stability through force. Complex systems with multiple competing interests are inherently unstable. When societies face stress, economic crisis, external threats, rapid change, the temptation to simplify, to unify under strong leadership, becomes overwhelming, and societies always face stress eventually. Another fragment describes the final age of Rome. When the eagle has fallen and the wolves have eaten its liver, when the people cry for bread and are given only spectacle, when the Senate bows to one man wearing a crown, this is the sunset of power. Rome fell. The prophecy was right, But Rome is also metaphor for any empire, any republic, any complex political system. America is Rome. Europe is Rome. Any democratic system that becomes powerful, wealthy, and complacent follows the same path. Bread and circuses. People distracted by entertainment while real power consolidates. The Senate, or Congress, or Parliament, becoming ceremonial. The emergence of a strongman leader who promises to fix everything if given enough authority. This is the pattern. This is what always happens. The Sibylline prophecy about the final age includes one more element. After the fall, a long darkness. Then, many small lights instead of one great fire. Interpretation. Empire gives way not to another empire, but to fragmentation. Localization. Smaller political units, less centralized power, diverse systems competing and cooperating. Rome fell and fragmented into medieval kingdoms, city-states, eventually nation-states. Now, nation-states are weakening. Global governance is failing. We're fragmenting again into regional blocs, cultural tribes, ideological factions. According to the Sibylline books, this isn't failure, it's transformation. Centralized systems collapse, they always do. The prophecy doesn't mourn this. It describes it as inevitable, necessary even. Many small lights might be better than one great fire. Fire burns, fire consumes, fire dies. Small lights can last longer, adapt faster, survive better. The Sibyls knew democracy wouldn't last. They knew authoritarianism would rise. They knew empires fall. They knew the light fragments. And they knew no one would listen, which is probably why they wrote it down. So when we're gone, whoever comes next might learn, or might repeat the same pattern again. Beneath the burning desert sun, the Israelites walked toward a promise, led by Moses, fleeing slavery in Egypt, wandering 40 years through wilderness, toward a land they had been told would be theirs. The Exodus is one of history's most famous stories. Religious Jews commemorate it annually at Passover. Christians view it as prefiguring salvation. Muslims honor Moses as a prophet. Even secular culture recognizes Exodus as a metaphor for liberation and mass migration. But here's what most people miss. The Exodus isn't just a singular historical event. It's a recurring pattern that has repeated throughout history and is repeating right now. The official religious narrative: God liberated the Israelites from slavery, parted the Red Sea, gave them the law at Sinai, and led them to Canaan. A one-time miracle, unique and unrepeatable. The historical narrative: the Exodus probably didn't happen as described. No archaeological evidence supports 1 million Israelites wandering the Sinai. But neither interpretation captures what the Exodus really is: a prophecy pattern describing what happens during civilizational collapse. When empires fail, when climate shifts, when resources become scarce, people move. Massive numbers walking away from the old order toward the promise of something better, even if the journey means suffering and uncertainty. This is happening now, globally. According to UNHCR, there are currently over 110 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. More than 1% of humanity is on the move, fleeing war, persecution, climate disaster, economic collapse. They're walking. They're packing what they can carry. They're leaving everything behind. They're crossing deadly terrain, hoping for a better future. They're experiencing the Exodus. The biblical Exodus has specific elements we see repeating: oppression and slavery, ecological disasters, the 10 plagues. The decision to leave when staying becomes more dangerous than the journey. The wilderness, 40 years of wandering. Today's refugees often spend years, sometimes decades, in transit. The promise: Canaan for today's migrants. It's Europe, America, Canada, Australia. Resistance: the Canaanites didn't welcome the Israelites. Modern receiving countries build walls, deploy militaries, pass restrictive laws. Climate migration specifically mirrors the Exodus pattern. The Mediterranean region is experiencing sustained drought. The Syrian civil war was partly triggered by the worst drought in 900 years, 2006-2010, forcing 2 million rural people into cities, creating social instability. Syria's population exodus, over 6 million refugees plus 6 million internally displaced, is one of the largest modern mass migrations. Central American caravans walking thousands of miles toward the U.S. border, fleeing gang violence, political instability, hurricanes, drought. Rohingya fleeing genocide in Myanmar. Sub-Saharan Africans crossing the Sahara Desert to reach Libya, then risking the Mediterranean crossing. Climate refugees from Pacific islands as sea levels rise. From Bangladesh as floods worsen. From Sub-Saharan Africa as desertification advances. All following the Exodus pattern. And here's the prophecy. The Exodus isn't an ending. The Israelites reach the Promised Land and immediately face conflict. The land is already occupied. Resources are limited. Different groups compete. Violence follows. The Promised Land isn't paradise. It's just different. Modern refugees who reach Europe or America often find discrimination, economic hardship, cultural alienation, hostility from native populations, legal limbo. The journey ends, but suffering doesn't. The Exodus pattern includes this. Liberation from one problem doesn't mean entering paradise. It means entering new problems. But the story also includes hope. Eventually, after struggle and adaptation, a new society forms. The Israelites became a nation. They created culture, laws, identity. They survived. Modern refugees will do the same. They're already doing it, building communities, preserving culture, adapting to new contexts, contributing to host societies. The children of refugees become doctors, engineers, artists, leaders. The Exodus pattern isn't tragedy. It's transformation. The prophet Isaiah spoke of a future Exodus, a return from Babylonian exile. Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. That's the prophecy. The Exodus keeps happening. Empires fall, climates shift, people move, they suffer, they adapt, they survive, and eventually they thrive. The current global migration crisis isn't an aberration. It's not a temporary problem solved with better policies or stronger borders. It's the Exodus pattern, which has been happening since humans existed and will continue as long as we exist. Moses never reached Canaan. He died in the wilderness, seeing the Promised Land from a distance. But his people continued. They finished the journey. They became something new. Today's refugees are walking, but someone will reach the destination eventually. That's not just hope. It's pattern recognition. It's prophecy. Across ancient civilizations, Mesopotamia, India, China, Greece, the Americas, flood myths tell of catastrophic events that reshaped the earth. Not gentle rains or predictable seasonal flooding, but apocalyptic deluges that drown the world. For millennia, these were dismissed as religious allegory, symbolic stories about divine judgment and moral cleansing, not historical events. Then the geology started proving them right. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written around 2100 BCE, describes Utnapishtim surviving a great flood sent by gods to destroy humanity. He builds a boat, saves his family and animals, and after 7 days, the waters recede. Sound familiar? The biblical flood story follows the same pattern. Noah builds an ark, God sends the deluge. Everything drowns except what's on the boat. Hindu tradition records Manu surviving a great flood. Greek mythology describes Deucalion's flood. Indigenous Australian stories describe the world being reshaped by massive floods. Native American traditions record catastrophic flooding. Chinese mythology describes Gun Yu controlling devastating floods. Every major ancient civilization has a flood story. The explanation was cultural diffusion or universal myth-making, but geological evidence tells a different story. These floods actually happened. At the end of the last ice age, approximately 12,000, 8,000 years ago, massive ice sheets covering North America and Northern Europe melted. Sea levels rose by about 120 meters, nearly 400 feet. Coastlines inhabited for thousands of years were inundated. Entire landscapes drowned. This wasn't gradual. Recent research shows it happened in pulses, periods of rapid catastrophic sea level rise. Around 8,200 years ago, the final collapse of the Laurentide ice sheet released vast amounts of freshwater into the North Atlantic, raising global sea levels by several meters in less than a century. Coastal settlements would have been destroyed. Millions would have been displaced or died. Anyone living through this would have experienced a great flood. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis suggests that around 5600 BCE, the Mediterranean Sea broke through a natural dam at the Bosphorus, causing the Black Sea to rise dramatically, possibly 150 meters. The flooding would have occurred rapidly, possibly within a few years. If humans were living around the shores, they would have witnessed their world literally drowning. Except it wasn't myth. It was history, encoded in narrative because writing didn't exist yet. Now, the prophecy. These flood stories aren't just historical records, they're warnings. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes the flood as divine punishment for human wickedness and noise. The land was bellowing like a bull. The god was disturbed by their uproar. Translation: human overpopulation and activity had disrupted the natural order. The biblical flood is explicitly about moral corruption, but also about the earth itself being corrupted. The Hebrew word means both, moral and physical corruption. Hindu traditions describe the flood as part of a cosmic cycle, not a one-time event, but recurring whenever humanity's age ends. The prophecy embedded in all these stories: the flood will happen again. And it is. Sea levels are currently rising at approximately 3.4 millimeters per year, accelerating. By 2100, estimates range from 0.3 to 2.5 meters of rise. 2.5 meters doesn't sound apocalyptic, but it would inundate massive coastal areas where billions live. Bangladesh, the Maldives, Pacific Islands, the Netherlands, Miami, New Orleans, Venice, Shanghai, Mumbai. And that's the conservative estimate. If the West Antarctic or Greenland ice sheets collapse faster than predicted, which recent observations suggest is possible, sea level rise could be much more dramatic. We could experience, within this century, displacements reminiscent of post-Ice Age floods. The prophecy isn't that God will send another flood. The prophecy is that floods are part of Earth's climate cycle. Ice ages come, ice ages end, water levels change dramatically. Civilizations adapt or die. We're at the end of the Holocene, which has lasted about 11,700 years, abnormally stable, allowing agriculture, cities, and complex civilization to develop. That stability is ending. The ancient flood stories encode this warning: stable climates don't last. The water rises, adapt, or drown. But there's another element: survivors. Every flood story includes someone who survives. Warned in advance, they prepare, save themselves, their families, and the knowledge necessary to rebuild. This is the hopeful element. The flood is inevitable, but survival is possible. Not everyone survives, but someone always makes it through. Modern climate science confirms this. Even worst-case scenarios don't predict human extinction. They predict massive disruption, displacement, death, but survival, adaptation, continuation. The species survives, civilization transforms, life continues. The ancient prophecies say, warnings will be ignored until it's too late. We're living that now. Climate scientists have warned for 50 years. The evidence mounts. Changes are visible, and we're still debating whether it's real. The water will answer. Amid the towering oak trees of ancient Britain, where morning mist clings to bark and shadows move with wind, the Druids practiced their mysteries. They were priests, judges, teachers, astronomers, the intellectual elite of Celtic society. And they prophesied about trees. Specifically, they prophesied that when their sacred groves were destroyed, when old forests were cut down, and the land dominated by those who didn't understand, the oak would eventually return, not through human effort, but through the will of the earth itself. The Romans documented Druidic practices with fascination and horror. Pliny the Elder described their oak worship, their ritual use of mistletoe, their belief that oaks were living connections between earth and sky. The Druids left no written records. Their knowledge was transmitted orally, deliberately never written to preserve its sacred nature. The Druids believed the oak was the axis of the natural world, that Britain's spiritual and ecological health depended on oak forests. When the Romans came, they systematically destroyed these groves. not just for timber, but as deliberate cultural and spiritual warfare. By the time Rome fell, Britain's ancient forests were significantly reduced. Over the next millennium, deforestation continued. By the 19th century, Britain had lost approximately 90% of its original forest cover. The oaks were gone. The Druidic prophecy, recorded in fragments by medieval Christian monks transcribing older oral traditions, stated, "When the children of iron cut down the children of earth, when the sacred groves become dust, when even memory fades, the oak will sleep. But the sleep is not death. When the iron children forget how to hear, when their towers crack, when their power wanes, the oak will wake, not through their planting, but through its own will." For over 1,000 years, this seemed like wishful thinking. The forests weren't coming back. Then something started happening. In the late 20th century, particularly after agricultural policy changes and declining intensive farming, oaks began returning to areas they had been absent from for centuries. Not through organized reforestation, spontaneously. Seeds carried by birds, by wind, by happenstance, taking root in abandoned fields, along motorway edges, in neglected spaces. Ecological surveys in the 1990s and 2000s documented oak regeneration in regions where it was thought impossible. Wales, Scotland, northern England, areas that had been treeless for generations, were showing oak saplings, young trees, the beginnings of woodland. Climate change is part of it. As temperatures rise and precipitation patterns shift, conditions once inhospitable to certain oak species are becoming suitable again. But there's something else? Recent soil studies show oak trees in Britain have mycorrhizal networks, fungal connections between trees that allow them to share nutrients and chemical signals. These networks can persist underground for decades, even centuries, after the trees themselves are cut down. The fungal network remembers where the oaks were. When conditions become suitable again, when saplings appear, the network connects to them, giving them access to resources, increasing survival rates, essentially helping the forest regenerate. The Druids didn't know about mycorrhizal networks. They didn't have the vocabulary, but they understood that forests have memory, that the relationship between oak trees and the land goes deeper than what's visible, that cutting down trees doesn't fully kill the forest. They said the oak would return when human power waned. Britain's power has waned. The empire that once ruled a quarter of the world is now a mid-sized European nation dealing with economic decline, political fragmentation, and post-Brexit identity crisis. The towers crack, both literally, infrastructure decay, and metaphorically, institutional failure. And the oaks are returning. This isn't just Britain. Across Europe and North America, rewilding is happening, sometimes intentionally, often spontaneously. Forests are reclaiming abandoned farmland, former industrial sites, even suburban development edges. In Chernobyl's exclusion zone, where humans abandoned the land after the nuclear disaster, forests have exploded. The radiation didn't kill the ecosystem, it killed human presence. Without humans, nature is thriving. The Druidic prophecy wasn't about Britain specifically. It was about the relationship between human civilization and the natural world. When humans dominate completely, forests retreat. When human systems fail or withdraw, forests return. The Druids understood something modern civilization is only now relearning. Humans don't control nature. We temporarily dominate it, push it back, reshape it. But nature is patient. It waits. And when our systems weaken through collapse, abandonment, or deliberate choice, it returns. The oak returns. Another fragment of Druidic prophecy. 3 things that come without asking: fear, death, and the green returning. The green returning, not if we allow it, not if we plant it. It returns regardless, filling spaces we leave behind, reclaiming what we took. One last fragment. The forest outlives the axe. The root outlives the blade. The silence outlives the noise. Britain's forests are returning, not everywhere, not quickly, not enough to undo the damage, but they're returning. The Druids said they would. The prophecy is fulfilling itself, slowly, quietly, one sapling at a time. In the quiet monasteries of ancient India, beneath the shade of the Bodhi tree where Siddhartha Gautama attained enlightenment, the Buddha spoke to his disciples about the future, and what he described was decay. The Buddha didn't claim his teachings would last forever. He explicitly stated they would decline, that the Dharma would gradually be forgotten, corrupted, lost. This is encoded in the concept of the Dharma ending age, Mappo in Japanese, Mofa in Chinese. The Buddha described 3 periods following his death. The age of true Dharma, approximately 500 to 1,000 years. People understand teachings correctly, practice authentically, and many attain enlightenment. The age of semblance Dharma, approximately 1,000 years. Teachings remain, people practice, but fewer attain realization. The form remains, but the essence weakens. The age of degenerate Dharma, approximately 10,000 years. Teachings are corrupted or forgotten, practice becomes superficial. Enlightenment is nearly impossible. According to traditional Buddhist chronology, we're currently in the age of degenerate Dharma. The prophecy wasn't vague. Buddhist texts describe specific signs. Monks will be corrupt, concerned with wealth and status. Temples will become rich, while practitioners are spiritually poor. The teachings will be intellectualized, but not practiced. Ritual will replace meditation. Disputes and schisms will fragment the Sangha. Materialism and desire will dominate society. People will have short attention spans. The Dharma will survive in name only, empty of true content. Let's check the list against reality. Corrupt monks, multiple scandals involving Buddhist teachers, financial exploitation, sexual abuse, authoritarian behavior, rich temples, poor practitioners. Some of the largest Buddhist organizations globally have significant wealth. Meanwhile, practitioners struggle with precarity, debt, anxiety. Intellectualization without practice. Buddhism has become popular in Western academia. Conferences, papers, books analyzing Buddhist philosophy. But meditation practice, less common. It's fashionable to discuss emptiness. Actually experiencing it, rare. Ritual replacing meditation. In many traditional Buddhist societies, Buddhism has become primarily ceremonial. Funerals, festivals, merit-making rituals. The contemplative core is often absent. Fragmentation. Buddhism has split into numerous schools, lineages, organizations, often with hostile relationships. The Sangha is fractured, materialism dominant. The Buddha's teachings emphasize non-attachment, simplicity, contentment. Modern society, even in historically Buddhist countries, is defined by consumerism, status competition, accumulation. Buddhist self-help books teach meditation for productivity gains. Mindfulness apps monetize what was supposed to be free. Short attention spans. The Buddha taught meditation requiring hours of sustained concentration. Modern humans struggle to focus for 10 minutes. We're neurologically rewired by technology for distraction. Emptiness of content. People identify with Buddhism aesthetically. Buddha statues as decor, Aum symbols, Zen minimalism. While knowing nothing about actual practice or philosophy, Buddhism is brand, not path. The Buddha predicted all of this over 2,500 years ago, but he also said this was inevitable, not because of moral failure, but because of fundamental laws of impermanence. Everything that arises passes away, including spiritual teachings. The Dharma is subject to the same law of impermanence the Buddha taught. He describes specific stages of loss. First, advanced meditation attainments become rare. Then, basic meditative absorption becomes difficult. Then, accurate understanding degrades. Then, ethical practice declines. Finally, even superficial knowledge disappears. We're somewhere in the middle stages. The Buddha also connected this spiritual decline to broader societal degeneration. In the Kakavati Esihanada Sutta, he describes a future society where human lifespan decreases, poverty increases while wealth concentrates, violence and warfare become common, moral standards collapse, natural beauty declines, humans become increasingly hostile and unable to cooperate. Sound familiar? The Buddha was describing what happens during civilizational decline. As material conditions worsen, spiritual practice becomes difficult. People are focused on survival, not enlightenment. When you're precarious, economically, physically, socially, you can't easily practice non-attachment or cultivate compassion. We're entering a chaotic phase. Climate change, political instability, economic inequality. technological disruption. The conditions that make spiritual practice difficult are intensifying. But here's the twist. After the Dharma ending age, the teachings don't disappear forever. Eventually, far in the future, a new Buddha arises, Maitreya, the future Buddha, and the wheel turns again. Decline isn't permanent. It's a phase of a larger cycle. The teachings will be lost, yes, but teachings can be found again. The Buddha's prophecy isn't a warning to preserve Buddhism at all costs. It's an acceptance that spiritual traditions, like everything else, are impermanent. They arise, serve their purpose, decline, and give way to what comes next. In one of his final teachings before death, the Buddha told his disciples, "Be a lamp unto yourselves, work out your own salvation with diligence." He was already prophesying that external structures would eventually fail them. The teachings would decline. They'd be on their own. We're on our own now. The lamp is dimming, but the prophecy doesn't end with darkness. It ends with a distant light, Maitreya, proving that the lamp, though it gutters and fades, never completely dies. It just waits for conditions to support its return. In the vast open spaces of the Australian outback, where red earth meets endless sky and silence holds weight, the Aboriginal people have preserved the oldest continuous culture on Earth. 60,000 plus years of unbroken tradition, oral history, and spiritual knowledge. And embedded in that knowledge is a prophecy about the Earth's final transformation. The Dreamtime isn't the past in Aboriginal understanding, it's the eternal present, the layer of reality beneath surface appearance, where the creative forces that shape the world still operate. Dreamtime stories aren't myths, they're maps, histories, laws, and prophecies encoded in narrative. Different Aboriginal nations have different versions, but common themes emerge. The earth will shake, the waters will rise and fall, the sky will change color, animals will forget their ways, and the clever people, humans who think they control nature, will cause these changes, but won't be able to stop them. Then comes the transformation, sometimes described as purification, sometimes as return to the dreamtime, sometimes as the world being sung again by the ancestors. For tens of thousands of years, this sounded like mystical poetry. Then modern science started confirming the details. The Earth will shake. Australia is experiencing increased seismic activity. Climate change is altering pressure on tectonic plates through ice sheet melting, changing ocean levels, and shifting crustal weight distribution. The Earth is literally responding to surface changes. Aboriginal elders report increasing earthquake frequency in their lifetimes, which seismological data confirms. The waters will rise and fall. Sea level rise is drowning coastal areas where Aboriginal communities have lived for millennia. Torres Strait Islands are losing land. Coastal clan territories are being inundated, but simultaneously inland areas experience extreme drought, water tables dropping, rivers drying, water holes disappearing. The waters are doing exactly what the prophecy described, rising in some places, falling in others, becoming unpredictable. Aboriginal Australians have oral histories describing coastlines drowned at the end of the last ice age, 12,000 to 8,000 years ago. These stories were dismissed as impossible. How could oral tradition preserve accurate information that long? Then archaeologists started finding Aboriginal settlement sites underwater off the Australian coast, exactly where the stories said they'd be. The stories were right. They'd preserved accurate coastal geography from before the post-ice age sea level rise, which means when Aboriginal elders say the waters will rise again, they're not speculating. They're remembering. It's happened before. Their stories recorded. It's happening again now. The sky will change color. Bushfire smoke has turned Australian skies apocalyptic orange, red, black. The 2019-2020 bushfire season was so severe that smoke circled the entire globe. Air pollution, atmospheric changes from greenhouse gases, and altered weather patterns are literally changing the sky's color. Aboriginal astronomy tracks celestial patterns over millennia. Elders report changes in star visibility, atmospheric clarity, and seasonal patterns that no longer match traditional knowledge. The sky has changed. Animals will forget their ways. This is perhaps the most haunting part. As climate shifts, animals are losing traditional migration routes, breeding behaviors, and survival strategies. Birds arriving at traditional nesting sites at the wrong time. Marine animals beaching themselves. Species appearing in areas they have never inhabited. From a human perspective, it looks like animals are behaving irrationally. From the prophecies' perspective, they've forgotten. The environmental cues that guided them for millions of years no longer match reality, so they're lost. The clever people will cause this but cannot stop it. This is the core of the prophecy. Humans, particularly those who believe technology and intelligence give them control over nature, will trigger these changes. But once triggered, the cascade cannot be stopped. This precisely describes climate change. Humans caused it through industrialization, deforestation, fossil fuel combustion. We understand the mechanism. But despite all our cleverness, we can't stop the momentum we've created. We were clever enough to break it, not clever enough to fix it. The prophecy then describes what comes after. Different Aboriginal nations have different versions. Some say the earth will sleep for a time before waking again, renewed. Some say the old people will return and restore balance. Some say humanity will split. Some will remember the old ways and survive. Others will cling to failed technologies and perish. All agree. This is a transition, not an ending. The earth will be remade, but life continues in new forms. What's remarkable is that Aboriginal prophecy doesn't blame humans in moral terms. It's not punishment for sin. It's consequence for forgetting that humans are part of nature, not separate from it. Aboriginal Australians live sustainably in one of the harshest environments on Earth for 60,000 years. That's not primitive survival. That's sophisticated environmental management. They knew how to live without breaking the earth. And the prophecy says, those who remember the old ways will survive what's coming. Those who don't, won't. In Dreamtime stories, the world has been made and remade multiple times. Creation isn't a one-time event. It's ongoing. The world is always being sung into existence. When the current world song ends, a new one begins. In an interview with Aboriginal elder Uncle Bob Randall before his death in 2015, he said, "The earth is not dying. The earth is giving birth. Birth is always painful, but what comes after, that's up to us." The prophecy isn't apocalypse, it's labor. Something old is ending. Something new is being born, and birth, always, is written in blood and water and screaming. In the shadow of Rome's Temple of Apollo, protected by elite priests, consulted only during crises, lay the Sibylline books, prophecies that Rome both feared and depended on for over 600 years. The Sibylline prophecies described an empire that would surpass Rome itself, one that wouldn't rely primarily on military conquest, but on economic control, cultural dominance, and technological superiority. An empire of commerce and information rather than legions. For centuries, this seemed like Roman imperial fantasy. The idea that one power could control the entire world was militarily and logistically impossible. Then came globalization. The Sibylline prophecies, in fragments preserved by early Christian writers, describe a future power that would control trade across all nations, impose a single system of law and commerce, spread a single language for business and learning, use invisible chains rather than visible armies, rule through debt and dependency rather than direct conquest, face no peer competitor, creating a unipolar world, eventually collapse from internal contradictions, not external threats. This describes American hegemony with uncomfortable precision. After World War II, the United States established a global system based on economic control, the dollar as reserve currency, the World Bank and IMF imposing economic policies, trade agreements favoring American interests. Single system, the Washington Consensus, neoliberal capitalism as the only legitimate economic system. Single language, English became the global language of business, science, aviation, diplomacy, internet. Invisible chains, economic dependence rather than military occupation. Sanctions as weapon, debt as control. No peer competitor. From 1991 to approximately 2015, the U.S. was the sole superpower. Internal collapse. American hegemony is declining not because of external military defeat, but because of internal problems. The Sibylline prophecy wasn't about Rome specifically. It was about the archetype of global empire, and Rome was just the first clear example. The Sibylline books also predicted that this global power would fragment, not all at once, but gradually as regional powers assert independence and the center loses the ability to maintain control. And during this fragmentation, there would be extreme danger, multiple powers competing for dominance, none strong enough to establish stable order, all strong enough to cause massive destruction. This describes the potential 21st century scenario: American decline, Chinese rise, Russian revisionism, European fragmentation, regional conflicts escalating without a global hegemon to manage them. The multipolar world emerging isn't necessarily more peaceful. It might be more dangerous. Unipolar hegemony, while unjust, was stable. Multipolarity is unstable. The prophecy specifically warns about this transition period, when the eagle can no longer fly, but has not yet fallen, when other beasts circle, but none can claim the throne. Blood will flow until exhaustion brings a new order, or the old order's ghost. Translation: the period between dominant empires is violent. Either a new hegemon emerges, or we enter a longer period of fragmented power, or the old hegemon reasserts control. We're in that transition now. The eagle, America, can't fly as it did, but hasn't fallen completely. Other powers are circling: China, Russia, regional blocs. Violence is escalating: Ukraine, Middle East, potential Taiwan crisis, African coups, Latin American instability. The prophecy says this transition period lasts decades, potentially generations. Another Sibylline fragment describes the rise of the kingdom of merchants, a power based not on territory but on trade, not on citizens but on contracts. This describes modern corporate globalism more than any specific nation. Multinational corporations now wield power, exceeding most countries. Apple's market capitalization exceeds the GDP of most nations. Amazon's logistics network rivals state infrastructure. Tech companies control information, flow more effectively than governments control borders. The kingdom of merchants isn't a country. It's the network of global corporations, banks, and institutions that operate transnationally, answering to shareholders rather than citizens, optimizing for profit rather than human welfare. The prophecy says this kingdom will eventually face revolt, not military overthrow, but refusal, people opting out, building alternative systems, withdrawing consent from the global system. We're seeing early signs: cryptocurrency attempting to circumvent banks, local movements rejecting globalism, communities building resilience, countries protecting domestic industries. Deglobalization. One of the most chilling Sibylline fragments describes the end stage: when all speak one tongue but understand nothing, when all bow to one power but trust nothing, when the world is united but peace exists nowhere, then the bonds will break, not all at once, thread by thread, until the cloth that seems so strong reveals it was always rotting. This describes late-stage globalization: English everywhere but communication failing, American dominance acknowledged but legitimacy collapsed, global trade networks but rising tensions, international institutions existing but ineffective. The system looks strong superficially, but is fundamentally weakened. And the prophecy says, when the cloth tears, it tears fast. Seemingly stable systems can collapse with shocking speed. The Sibylline prophecy about global empire doesn't end with collapse. It ends with a question: when the eagle falls, will the world sing with many voices, or will one new voice silence all others? Does American decline lead to multipolarity and diversity, or does a new hegemon impose new uniformity? The answer isn't written. The prophecy ends with uncertainty. The future isn't fixed. The cloth is tearing, thread by thread. What we weave from the pieces, that's on us. In the remote deserts of the American Southwest, atop windswept mesas where earth meets sky with startling clarity, the Hopi people have preserved prophecies passed down through generations. Prophecies that describe the world we're living in right now with unsettling accuracy. The Hopi prophecy tradition speaks of multiple world ages. We are living in the fourth world. The first three worlds were destroyed by fire, by ice, by flood, because humanity forgot the sacred instructions and fell into corruption. The fourth world, the Hopi say, is approaching its end. Not yet, but approaching, and the signs are clear. Thomas Banyasya, a Hopi elder who spent decades trying to share Hopi prophecy with the world, including addressing the UN General Assembly in 1992, described the warning signs. You will see white men in the sky, planes, satellites, space tourism, roads in the sky, contrails, satellite grids. The land will be crossed by snakes of iron, railroads. The land will be crisscrossed by rivers of stone, highways. The sea will turn black, and many living things will die. Oil spills, ocean acidification. You will hear of a great dwelling place in the sky above the Earth, International Space Station. You will hear of a gourd of ashes that will fall from the sky and burn everything, making the land sterile for generations, the atomic bomb. Near the day of purification, there will be cobwebs spun back and forth in the sky, power lines, the internet. The earth will become unbalanced, the seasons will change, animals will begin to disappear, climate change, mass extinction. These aren't vague predictions, they're specific, and many have been fulfilled with precision that defies coincidence. But the core of Hopi prophecy isn't just prediction, it's warning. The prophecy says these signs indicate the world is approaching a choice point, the day of purification. This isn't the end of the world. It's the end of the fourth world and the potential beginning of the fifth world. But the transition is violent, a purification through catastrophe. The Hopi prophecy describes two paths forward: the path of technology, continuing on the current trajectory, environmental destruction, spiritual emptiness, materialistic obsession, disconnection from nature. This path leads to catastrophic purification, climate disaster, war, societal collapse. Survival is possible, but barely, and only for those who remember the sacred instructions. The path of spirit, returning to balance. Respecting nature, living sustainably, recognizing the sacred in all things, rebuilding community. This path still involves hardship, but less catastrophic, with better outcomes. The prophecy says humanity is currently on the path of technology and hasn't yet genuinely chosen the path of spirit, though some individuals and communities are trying. And here's where the Kachina spirits come in. Kachinas in Hopi tradition are spirit beings, not gods exactly, but sacred messengers, teachers, embodiments of natural and spiritual forces. They visit the Hopi during the ceremonial season, bringing blessings, teaching, maintaining cosmic balance. The prophecy says that before the day of purification, the Kachinas will remove their masks in the plaza, meaning they will reveal themselves openly, not in ceremony, but in reality. The spirits will return not as metaphor, but as presence. What does this mean? Traditional interpretation: literal spirit beings will manifest. Psychological interpretation: humans will experience a collective shift in consciousness. Ecological interpretation: nature itself will speak through catastrophes so obvious that even materialistic humans will recognize we're part of something larger. All three might be true simultaneously. Climate disasters are forcing even the most skeptical to recognize that we're not separate from nature, we're subject to it. The spirits of water, air, earth, and fire are demonstrating their power through hurricanes, droughts, fires, floods. The Kachinas are removing their masks, the pretense that nature is passive, controllable, subordinate to human will. That mask is being torn away. The Hopi prophecy includes a specific detail. The Hopi land is a spiritual center that must be protected. If the Hopi lose their land, if their ceremonies stop, if their way of life is destroyed, the balance collapses completely, and the purification becomes inevitable and severe. The prophecy says, as long as the Hopi continue the ceremonies, the world is held in balance, barely, precariously, but held. If they stop, the thread breaks. This seems superstitious unless you understand it differently. The Hopi ceremonies encode sustainable practices, ecological knowledge, spiritual grounding. As long as someone maintains these practices, keeps the knowledge alive, humanity has a thread connecting us to sustainable ways of living. If that thread breaks completely, we're fully committed to the path of technology with no way back. Thomas Banyasya, speaking at the UN, said, We are now very close to the day of purification. Severe climate changes, earthquakes, fires, floods, these are the birth pains. We must return to the sacred instructions before it's too late. He died in 1999. Since then, climate disasters have accelerated exactly as the prophecy described. The Hopi prophecy ends with cautious hope. After the purification, the fifth world emerges, a world where humanity has learned to live in balance. Not everyone survives, not every nation or culture persists, but the earth survives, life survives, and those who remembered the sacred instructions become the seed people of the fifth world. The Kachinas are here now. No masks, no ceremony, just consequences. In the cold, harsh lands of the north, where winter can kill and the summer sun never fully sets, the Norse people developed a cosmology that understood endings, not as tragedy, but as inevitability. The Norse called it Fimbulwinter, the Great Winter, 3 years of brutal cold with no summer in between, the harbinger of Ragnarok. But Fimbulwinter isn't just mythological apocalypse, it's historical memory and future prophecy simultaneously. The Norse experienced catastrophic climate events. The medieval warm period, roughly 950 to 1250 CE, allowed Norse expansion, the Viking Age, settlements in Iceland and Greenland, exploration to North America. Then came the Little Ice Age, roughly 1300 or 1850 CE, beginning with the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, years of catastrophic cold and rain that destroyed crops, killed livestock, caused widespread starvation. The Norse colony in Greenland, established during the warm period, couldn't survive. By 1450, it was abandoned. The Norse experienced Fimbulwinter. They saw how quickly climate shift could destroy societies that seemed stable, and they encoded this experience as prophecy. It will happen again. Modern climate science confirms this isn't paranoia, it's realism. Earth's climate has periodic instabilities. We're currently in an interglacial period that has lasted about 11,700 years. We're due. Except now, human-caused warming is overlapping with natural climate variability, creating unpredictable interactions. Some climate models suggest that Arctic ice melt could actually trigger regional cooling in the North Atlantic by disrupting the Gulf Stream. Paradoxically, global warming could cause localized Fimbulwinter, Northern Europe freezing, while global average temperature rises. But Fimbulwinter isn't just climate. In Norse prophecy, it's also social, the complete breakdown of social order before the final conflict. The Völuspá describes it. Brothers will fight and kill each other, sisters' children will defile kinship. It is harsh in the world, whoredom rife, an axe age, a sword age, shields are riven, a wind age, a wolf age, before the world goes headlong. Social cohesion collapsing, kinship bonds breaking, moral restraints failing, violence within families and communities, everyone fighting everyone else. We're watching this happen in real time. Political polarization so severe that families split, communities fragmenting along ideological lines, trust in institutions collapsing, social capital, the network of relationships and norms that hold societies together, eroding rapidly. Robert Putnam's research documented declining social capital in America over decades. Global surveys show declining trust in government, media, corporations, even neighbors. The bonds that held societies together are weakening. The Norse called this the wolf age, everyone becoming predatory, looking out only for themselves, social cooperation failing. In wolf age conditions, when winter comes, literal or metaphorical, societies can't organize collective responses. Climate disasters test social cohesion. When resources are abundant, cooperation is easy. When resources are scarce, cooperation requires sacrifice. And in wolf age conditions, sacrifice is rare. The Norse prophecy says that Fimbulwinter leads to Ragnarok, the final battle where gods, giants, monsters, and humans fight until most are destroyed. But this isn't supernatural warfare. It's metaphor for civilizational collapse through warfare triggered by resource scarcity. History shows this pattern: climate stress, resource scarcity, migration, conflict, societal collapse. We're entering the stress phase now. The scarcity is coming. The migrations are beginning. The conflicts are escalating. The Norse were realistic about this. They didn't believe human effort could prevent Ragnarok. It was fate, not because gods decreed it, but because the pattern was inevitable given human nature and climate cycles. But, and this is crucial, Ragnarok isn't the end. After the fire and the flood, after the gods die and everything burns, the earth rises again from the water, green and fertile. Some gods survive. 2 humans survive, hidden in the world tree. Life continues. The Norse understood that apocalypse is transformation, not termination. The world ends, this age, this order. But the earth persists, life persists, and something new begins. This is profoundly different from Christian apocalypse or modern atheist apocalypse. The Norse prophecy is cyclical. Destruction leads to renewal. Modern civilization, built during an unusually stable climate period, has forgotten this wisdom. We believe stability is normal and catastrophe is aberration. The Norse knew the opposite. Catastrophe is normal. Stability is temporary luxury. As climate destabilizes, as social order fragments, as conflicts intensify, we're rediscovering what the Norse always knew. The great winter comes, not because we're evil, not because gods are angry, because that's what the earth does. Climate shifts, societies fall, life continues. The question isn't whether Fimbulwinter comes, it's who survives it and what they build afterward. The Norse didn't fear Ragnarok. They prepared for it. They built societies that could survive harsh conditions. They preserved knowledge through oral tradition. They developed resilience. When the Great Winter came, and it did historically, some survived because they were prepared. Fimbulwinter is coming again. The cold isn't just climate, it's economic, social, political, the isolation, the scarcity, the breakdown. The prophecy says, those who understand this, who prepare, who maintain bonds even in wolf age conditions, they survive to see the spring after the fire. Winter comes, always, eventually, ready or not. Beneath the shadow of Tenochtitlan's magnificent pyramids, the Aztec priests performed calculations, tracked celestial movements, and prepared their people for a truth they knew was coming. This world age was ending. The Aztec creation myth describes 4 previous worlds, each ending catastrophically. First sun ended when jaguars devoured all humans, ecological metaphor, wildlife overwhelming populations. Second sun ended when hurricanes destroyed everything and survivors became monkeys, climate disaster. Third sun ended when fire rained from the sky and survivors became birds, volcanic metaphor. Fourth sun ended when massive floods drowned the world, the classic deluge narrative. Fifth sun, our current age, the sun of movement Suaster earthquake, and according to prophecy, it will end through earthquakes and starvation. The Aztecs understood they weren't living in a permanent world. They were living in the 5th iteration, and like the previous 4, it was temporary. This wasn't pessimism, it was cosmic realism. Everything that exists eventually ends. But here's what makes the 5th sun prophecy particularly relevant: the specific manner of its ending. The 5th sun will end through Allen, movement, specifically seismic movement, earthquakes. And the prophecy says this will coincide with starvation, agricultural collapse, food systems failing. Does this describe our potential future? Seismic activity debates aside, human infrastructure is increasingly vulnerable to earthquakes as cities grow larger and more complex. But the deeper connection is metaphorical. Allen means not just physical earthquakes, but instability, upheaval, everything in flux. The ground shifting beneath our feet, literally and figuratively. Modern society is experiencing Olin: political instability, economic volatility, social upheaval, technological disruption, climate instability. Nothing feels solid. Everything that seemed permanent is revealed as contingent. The ground is shaking, not always physically, but systematically. The foundations are unstable. And starvation? Agricultural systems are under unprecedented stress. Climate change is disrupting growing seasons, causing crop failures, intensifying droughts and floods. Soil degradation is accelerating. Pollinators are declining. Industrial agriculture is depleting resources it depends on. The UN warns that without major changes, global food systems face potential collapse within decades. Not everyone will starve. Wealthier nations will import food, buy their way to security. But millions, potentially billions, face food insecurity. The fifth sun prophecy: instability and starvation together. We're watching it begin. But the Aztec prophecy includes instructions. How to delay the end. The Aztecs believed the fifth sun needed to be fed to keep burning, fed with sacrifice. Strip away the literal human sacrifice, and you're left with a profound truth. Sustaining the world requires sacrifice. Not blood ritually, but effort, resources, selflessness. Modern civilization wants the world to sustain us without us sacrificing anything for it. We extract, consume, pollute, taking without giving back. We want the sun to keep shining without feeding it. The Aztec prophecy says that doesn't work. The age ends when humans stop giving back, when the relationship becomes purely extractive. Climate change is precisely this. We extracted fossil fuels, burned them, released carbon without returning anything to balance the system. We took the stability of the Holocene climate without sacrificing the convenience of unlimited energy use. The fifth sun is dying because we stopped feeding it. Now, the Aztecs also believed in cyclical continuation. When the fifth sun ends, a sixth sun will eventually begin. Not immediately. There's a period of darkness and chaos first. But eventually, a new age starts. What would the sixth sun look like? Perhaps a world after climate catastrophe, after population decline, after industrial civilizations collapse. A world where humans have been forced, through suffering, to live differently. Smaller populations, lower consumption, integration with rather than domination of nature. Not utopia, just different. The Spanish conquest, from the Aztec perspective, wasn't the cause of the fifth sun's end. It was evidence that the end was already underway. The social, ecological, spiritual conditions were already degrading. The Spanish arrival was a symptom, not the cause. Similarly, our current crises aren't causing the end of our world age. They're symptoms that the end is already in process. The fifth sun is dying, has been dying for a while. We're just starting to notice. Aztec prophecy includes the time between the fires. When the old sun dies before the new sun is kindled, there's darkness, uncertainty, chaos, but also possibility. In the darkness between suns, anything can happen. The rules of the old age no longer apply, and the rules of the new age haven't been established. It's terrifying, but also creatively open. We're entering that darkness now. The old certainties are dying. The new lights haven't been lit yet. We're in between. The Aztec prophecy says this is when choices matter most. How we navigate the darkness determines what kind of sun rises next. The transition is inevitable. The character of what comes after is not. One final element. It ends with all-in, movement. But all-in also means transformation, change, the dance of creation and destruction. The fifth sun doesn't just end, it transforms into the sixth. We're not witnessing an ending. We're witnessing a transformation. The Aztecs understood the difference. The question is, do we? By candlelight in the small French town of Salon de Provence, Michel de Nostradamus wrote Century 6, Quatrain 23, "The Black One will have a great empire. He will be opposed by good leaders. The land will be in great trouble. The empire will show great destruction." For centuries, interpreters struggled with le noir, the black one. Skin color, clothing, moral darkness. None of the interpretations seemed to fit historical events convincingly, until recently. Multiple quatrains reference this black king or dark leader, figure describing a leader or a movement, characterized by darkness, autocracy, and the disruption of the existing world order. Nostradamus scholars have debated whether these refer to one individual or multiple leaders across history. Napoleon was considered a candidate. Hitler fit better. Darkness, destruction, roughly 27 years of Nazi activity. But what if the Black King isn't a single person? What if it's a pattern, the rise of authoritarianism characterized by darkness, secrecy, oppression, moral void? We're watching this pattern repeat globally. Putin in Russia consolidated power, eliminated opposition, invaded neighbors. Xi in China removed term limits, established surveillance state, crushed dissent. Erdogan in Turkey shifted from democracy toward autocracy. Modi in India, Hindu nationalism, democratic backsliding. The global rise of far-right nationalism across Europe. Trump's presidency raising questions about democratic resilience. The Black King might be the spirit of our age. Authoritarianism rising simultaneously across multiple nations. A global shift away from democracy and toward strongman rule. Nostradamus's quatrains describe this leader movement as causing great suffering, violence, and forcing people to flee. This describes the refugee crises created by authoritarian regimes. Syrians fleeing Assad, Venezuelans fleeing Maduro, Rohingya fleeing Myanmar's military, Uyghurs persecuted in Xinjiang, Russians fleeing mobilization. Authoritarianism creates refugees. The Black King causes suffering not just within borders, but through displacement, creating cascading instability. But there's another layer, the relationship with technology. Century 2, Quatrain 41 could describe technological catastrophe, AI, surveillance systems, digital control creating a double reality, physical and digital. Nostradamus didn't have vocabulary for artificial intelligence or digital surveillance, but he describes something that creates total control, monitors constantly, and changes reality itself. China's social credit system, algorithms monitoring citizens, controlling access to services, enforcing behavior through automated surveillance. This is Black King power enabled by technology, not just human tyranny, but system tyranny, where resistance becomes impossible because the system is everywhere. The prophecy warns this spreads beyond one nation. Other countries adopt similar systems. Century X. Quatrain 72 describes a period when authoritarian powers ascend while democracies falter. Mars to reign by good luck suggests military power succeeding through fortune rather than justice. During crises, pandemics, economic collapse, climate disasters, people often turn to authoritarian solutions. Strong leadership, simplified narratives, scapegoats to blame. Democracy is messy, requires patience, tolerates dissent. Authoritarianism offers illusory certainty. The Black King rises not through force alone, but through offering false solutions to real problems. People welcome the darkness because it promises order. Nostradamus's prophecy warns this ends badly. The Black King's reign brings temporary stability through oppression, but eventually causes great destruction, war, economic collapse, social disintegration. Authoritarianism is inherently unstable. It appears strong, but is actually brittle, without feedback mechanisms, without dissent, without course correction. Authoritarian systems make catastrophic errors. They suppress information about problems until the problems become unsolvable. The Soviet Union looked powerful until it suddenly collapsed. The Qing dynasty looked eternal until it suddenly ended. Nazi Germany seemed invincible until it very suddenly wasn't. Authoritarian systems can last decades, but they eventually fail, often catastrophically, often through war. Century 2, Quatrain 46 describes cascading crises. After great trouble for humanity, a greater one approaches. These crises compound during authoritarian periods because authoritarians can't adapt. They double down, suppress information, blame external enemies, and make everything worse. The prophecy says, after the Black King rises, after the period of oppression and false order, comes the breakdown. Not immediately. These systems persist for years, but eventually, inevitably. And after the breakdown, Nostradamus is less clear. Some quatrains suggest renewal, others continued chaos. Century 1, Quatrain 63. The world returns to ancient times before the great cycle begins again. After the age of the Black King, after the troubles, after the collapse, a return to ancient times. Perhaps recognizing ancient wisdom, that power concentrated corrupts, that empires fall, that sustainable societies require balance and limits. The great cycle begins again, meaning this pattern repeats. The Black King will rise again in future ages, when people forget the lessons. Nostradamus isn't predicting a permanent dark age. He's predicting a cycle. Democracy, crisis, authoritarianism, catastrophe, renewal, democracy, crisis. We're in the authoritarianism phase now. globally. The catastrophe comes next, according to the pattern. Then renewal, eventually. The Black King always falls. The question is how much he destroys before falling, and whether we learn anything before the cycle begins again. In the dense jungles of Central America, where ancient stone cities lie draped in green, the Maya priests calculated the end of one age and the beginning of another. The Maya, like the Aztecs, understood that we live in world ages. The current age, the fifth sun, is ending. What comes next is the sixth sun. But the sixth sun won't arrive peacefully. The transition is violent, transformative, requiring the destruction of old forms before new ones can emerge. The Chilam Balam, a collection of Yucatec Maya texts recording older oral traditions, describes the transition. When the age ends, the sky will split, the earth will shake, the water will rise. Those who cling to the old ways will be swept away. Those who open themselves to the new will survive, transformed. The sky will split, atmospheric changes so severe they're visible and terrifying. The earth will shake, literal seismic activity or metaphorical upheaval. The water will rise, sea level rise, or the metaphorical flood of change. All interpretations might be true simultaneously. The Maya encoded multiple levels of meaning. But the critical part, those who cling to the old ways will be swept away. Those who open themselves to the new will survive, transformed. This describes psychological spiritual adaptation as crucial to physical survival. Those who try to maintain the old order will be destroyed by their own rigidity. Those who adapt, who release attachment to how things were, who embrace transformation, they survive, but they're transformed. What is the sixth sun? Mayan prophecy suggests it's characterized by reduced population. Not everyone makes it through. Return to balance. Human population reduced to levels the earth can sustainably support. New consciousness. Survivors develop different relationships with nature, with each other, with the sacred. Decentralization. Large empires, nation-states, global systems break down. Integration of technology and nature. Selective use. Technologies that support life rather than exploit it. This describes post-collapse civilization. What might emerge after industrial civilization fails, but humans survive. We see proto-versions now, permaculture communities, eco-villages, indigenous resurgence movements, appropriate technology advocates, relocalization movements. These are seeds of the sixth sun taking root before the fifth sun fully ends. The Mayan prophecy says the transition is already underway. It's not a sudden event. It's a process lasting decades or centuries. We're in it now. The signs, according to the Chilam Balam, the rulers will become corrupt and the people will lose faith. Global surveys show declining trust in government. The rains will fail and the crops will die, climate disruption causing agricultural failures. The animals will leave and the forests will burn. Mass extinction, unprecedented wildfires. The young will not remember the old ways, and the old will not understand the new, generational. Disconnect, fragmenting shared culture. Strange lights will appear in the sky. UFO phenomena, auroras at unusual latitudes, satellites, atmospheric changes. The earth will speak and few will listen, nature giving clear signals of system failure, humanity ignoring warnings. We're living this now. The earth is speaking through every climate report, every extinct species, every coral reef dying, every glacier melting. The message is clear. The current system is failing. Few are listening. Most continue business as usual, hoping technology will fix it, or denying the problem exists. The Mayan prophecy says this ends when it becomes impossible to ignore, when consequences are so severe that even the most willfully blind cannot avoid them. Then the transition accelerates. The sixth sun doesn't wait for permission. It arrives through force of circumstance. Another element, the transition between suns requires sacrifice. Not human sacrifice literally, but sacrifice of the ego, of identity, of attachment to the world as we knew it. You can't enter the sixth sun carrying the fifth sun's baggage. The old identity, consumer, citizen of nation state, participant in global capitalism, believer in infinite growth, that identity dies. A new identity emerges, participant in local ecosystem, member of small community, person who lives within planetary limits. This isn't spiritual bypassing. This is practical necessity. The sixth sun won't support the lifestyles and identities the fifth sun did. Those identities become literally impossible to maintain. The Mayan prophecy is clear. Resistance to this transformation causes suffering. The more you cling to the fifth sun identity, the more painful the transition. Those who release attachment, who die to the old self and allow the new self to emerge, they suffer less. The Chilambalam includes ritual instruction. When the age ends, go to the cenote, enter the water, submerge completely. Stay under until you cannot hold your breath. Surface gasping. You are reborn. This describes initiation, death, and rebirth. You must fully release before you can return, transformed. One final detail. The sixth sun rises from the west, not the east. All previous ages were oriented toward the east. Sunrise, beginning, masculine principle. The sixth sun rises from the west, sunset, endings, feminine principle. This suggests the sixth sun is fundamentally different, not about expansion, conquest, growth, domination, about receptivity, sustainability, cyclical time, integration. After an age defined by yang, an age characterized by yin, the fifth sun is dying, the sixth is being born. We're the generation that experiences both. Birth is always bloody, always painful, but it's birth nonetheless. The prophecies of the end times, the final revelation. The ancient texts from every corner of the world speak of a final reckoning, not the end of all things, but the end of an age, a moment when all truths are revealed, when hidden things become visible, when the accumulated consequences of human choices manifest all at once. This is the Revelation pattern. The Christian book of Revelation is the most famous Western version, but similar apocalyptic literature exists across cultures. All describe the same pattern: growing corruption, warning signs ignored, crisis point, revelation, hidden truths suddenly becoming undeniable, judgment, purification, survivors, renewal. We're currently in stages 2 but 3, approaching stage 4. The revelation pattern isn't about divine judgment in a moral sense. It's about complex systems reaching failure points, where hidden weaknesses suddenly become catastrophically visible. Think of the 2008 financial crisis. For years, experts warned about housing bubbles, subprime mortgages, excessive leverage. Most people ignored the warnings. The system seemed fine. Then suddenly, it collapsed. Within weeks, the hidden rot was revealed: fraudulent securities, predatory lending, systemic corruption. The revelation wasn't gradual. It was sudden, shocking, undeniable. That's the pattern. Not slow decline everyone can see coming. Apparent stability, then sudden collapse revealing what was hidden. We're living in a pre-revelation moment across multiple domains. Climate. Scientists have warned for 50 years. Revelation happens when impacts become undeniable through lived experience. Political, democratic institutions appearing solid but actually hollow. Revelation comes when they fail during crisis. Economic, apparent prosperity built on debt and exploitation. Revelation comes when the system that seemed eternal reveals itself as a Ponzi scheme. Ecological, biodiversity loss, soil degradation happening gradually. Revelation comes when ecosystem services suddenly fail. Social, communities fragmenting, trust eroding. Revelation when cooperation becomes impossible. The revelation pattern says, these hidden problems don't reveal themselves gradually. They reveal themselves suddenly, often during a crisis that triggers cascading failures across multiple systems. The pandemic was a preview. Suddenly, global supply chains revealed as fragile, healthcare systems revealed as inadequate, political leadership revealed as incompetent, social cohesion revealed as shallow. But COVID was a relatively mild revelation. The prophecies describe something far more comprehensive, not one system failing, but multiple systems failing simultaneously, revealing that everything was connected, everything was fragile, everything was built on foundations weaker than we believed. The book of Revelation describes this with vivid imagery: 7 seals breaking, 7 trumpets sounding, 7 bowls of wrath poured out. Strip away religious symbolism, and you're describing cascading systemic failures. Environmental collapse, economic collapse, political collapse, spiritual collapse, all happening not sequentially, but simultaneously, each amplifying the others. We're approaching this convergence not because God is angry, because we built systems that couldn't be sustained, and physics doesn't care about our beliefs. But here's the crucial part. It's not total annihilation. It's revelation, unveiling, followed by judgment, consequences manifesting, followed by renewal. The purpose isn't to end everything. It's to reveal truth forcefully enough that denial becomes impossible, forcing transformation. Every apocalyptic tradition includes survivors: Noah and his family, Manu on his boat, the two humans in Yggdrasil, the remnant who knew the old ways. Revelation is catastrophic, but not extinction level. Most people don't survive unchanged, but some survive. And in surviving, they're transformed, forced to abandon delusions, forced to adapt, forced to build differently. The New Testament ends with Revelation's vision of a new Jerusalem, not heaven, but renewed earth. Not escape from physical reality, but transformation of it. The same earth, purified through fire, made new. Every apocalyptic tradition ends similarly: renewal, the world remade, a new age beginning with fewer people, harder conditions, but also new possibilities. The Revelation pattern is optimistic, strangely. Yes, catastrophe comes. Yes, most of what we know will be destroyed, but life continues, humanity continues. The possibility of building better remains. The prophecy says, we get another chance. After the revelation, after the consequences, after the fire, another chance. Whether we use it well is up to us. The cycle can repeat. Build, corruption, collapse, renewal, build, corruption, collapse. Or we can learn, we can remember, we can build systems that don't require catastrophic revelation to correct. But history suggests we usually don't learn. We build again, we forget. The same patterns recur. The prophecy doesn't say whether we'll break the cycle. It just says the cycle exists. We're approaching the revelation phase now. The corruption is advanced, the warnings are ignored, the crisis is converging. The question isn't whether revelation comes. It's what we do when it arrives. Do we face truth when it's finally undeniable? Do we accept consequences and adapt? Do we remember the lessons for the next cycle? Or do we deny even as the world burns, rationalize even as systems collapse, cling to delusions until they're torn from our hands? The prophecy says, some will see, some won't. Some will adapt, some won't. Some will survive, some won't. Not because God chooses, because reality doesn't negotiate. The revelation is coming, not from the sky, from the earth, from the systems we built, from the consequences we created. All hidden things will be revealed. All illusions will burn away. What remains after fire is what was real all along. Truth doesn't need revelation. We do. We're watching it now. Not coming, happening. The largest mass migration in human history is underway, and it's only beginning. Over 110 million forcibly displaced people according to UNHCR. More than 1% of humanity on the move, fleeing war, persecution, and increasingly, climate disaster. By 2050, estimates suggest 200 million to 1 billion climate refugees. 1 billion people, 1 in 8 humans. Every prophetic tradition predicted this. Massive migrations during the end times, populations fleeing catastrophe, borders overwhelmed, nations unable or unwilling to accommodate the displaced. The biblical exodus wasn't a unique event. It was the archetype, the pattern that repeats whenever civilizations fail and ecosystems collapse. And it's happening everywhere. Africa, Sahel region becoming uninhabitable. Millions moving toward North Africa and Europe, risking death in the Sahara and Mediterranean. West Africa facing coastal inundation. East Africa experiencing drought-driven famine and violence. Middle East, Syria's civil war partially triggered by the worst drought in 900 years. Iraq facing water crisis. Yemen in humanitarian catastrophe. Afghanistan in perpetual crisis, millions fleeing. South Asia, Bangladesh facing catastrophic sea level rise that could displace 20 million people. Pakistan experiencing deadly heat waves and flooding. India facing water scarcity affecting hundreds of millions. Central America, violence, corruption, and climate-driven agricultural failure pushing millions northward through Mexico toward the U.S., where they face militarized borders and detention camps. Pacific Islands. Entire island nations facing existential threat from sea level rise. Kiribati, Tuvalu, Marshall Islands. Countries that will literally disappear. Where do citizens go when their nation ceases to exist? The prophecies describe this. People fleeing in massive numbers, wealthy nations building walls, hostility toward the desperate, violence at borders, humans treating other humans as invaders, threats, problems to be repelled rather than people needing help. This isn't future speculation, it's current events. Europe's refugee crisis of 2015-2016, when over 1 million asylum seekers arrived, revealed how unprepared wealthy nations are. Political systems destabilized, far-right parties gained power, border fences went up, nationalist sentiment surged. And that was a relatively small wave compared to what's coming. Climate refugees will dwarf today's numbers. When coastal cities flood, when agricultural regions become unfarmable, when water scarcity causes conflict, hundreds of millions will move. Not want to, have to. The prophecies said borders would fail, not through invasion, but through overwhelming need. You can build walls, but walls don't stop climate change. The refugees will come because staying means death, and receiving countries will face impossible choices. Open borders and face economic, social, political stress, or close borders and become complicit in mass death. There's no good option. The prophecy says the exodus happens regardless. How nations respond determines their own fate, whether they maintain humanity or descend into barbarism. The pattern is clear from history. Migrations happen. Civilizations either absorb newcomers and transform, or violently resist and collapse under the strain. Rome absorbed migrations, usually, and survived for centuries. When it finally refused, late empire, it collapsed faster. China's dynasties absorbed or expelled border peoples cyclically. Absorption brought strength and cultural flowering. Exclusion brought conflict and dynastic decline. The prophecy says human populations move, always have, always will. Climate shifts, resources disappear, wars displace, people walk. They walk with their children, carrying what they can towards safety they hope exists. Stopping them requires levels of violence that destroy the soul of the societies committing it. The prophecy is this: nations that try to maintain their privilege through violent exclusion during the Great Migrations will be destroyed, not by refugees, but by the moral and practical contradictions of maintaining walls while the world burns. Nations that open, that adapt, that recognize we're all in this together, they might survive. Transformed, certainly. Stressed, absolutely. But functional. The Exodus is prophesied not as punishment, but as consequence. We built a global civilization that destabilizes climate and ecosystems. The destabilization produces migration. The migration tests whether human solidarity extends beyond tribal national boundaries. So far, the test shows not much. Nationalism is surging, borders are hardening, refugees are demonized, detained, turned away to die. The prophecy says this approach fails. You cannot have globalized capitalism, with wealthy nations extracting resources from poor nations, driving climate change that affects everyone, and then refuse to accept refugees when the system breaks down. The exodus will happen, and grows, until it becomes not a humanitarian crisis at the margins, but the central reality of 21st century civilization. We're all refugees eventually, some sooner, some later. Climate change doesn't respect borders. The floods will come for coastal cities and wealthy nations too. The fires will burn suburbs. The droughts will affect agriculture everywhere. The distinction between refugee and citizen is temporary. The prophecy says this becomes clear, and when it does, the borders that seem so important reveal themselves as illusory. We are one species on one planet facing one crisis. The Exodus is humanity moving across a planet that's becoming inhospitable in some places, looking for places still viable. It's not invasion, it's survival. The prophecy ends with a question. Will we recognize ourselves in the refugees, or will we maintain the delusion of separation until it's too late? The answer determines whether we survive, together or die separately. The exodus has begun. Where are you in the pattern? Here's the prophecy nobody wants to hear. We might not wake up in time. Every tradition has versions of this. The warning ignored, the people sleeping while catastrophe approaches, the prophets crying in the wilderness, the truth spoken to deaf ears. We're living that now. The prophecy isn't that doom comes, it's that we see it coming and do nothing. Climate science has been clear for 50 years. The predictions from the 1970s have proven accurate. We knew. Scientists warned, activists pleaded, the evidence mounted, and we changed almost nothing. CO2 emissions haven't peaked, fossil fuel use continues, deforestation continues, ocean pollution continues. We're moving in the right direction too slowly to matter. The prophecy said this would happen, not because humans are evil, but because we're psychologically incapable of responding to slow-moving threats. We evolved to handle immediate dangers, predators, tribal conflicts, resource competition. We didn't evolve to respond to abstract, delayed, probabilistic threats that unfold over decades. Climate change is the perfect threat we can't handle psychologically. It's slow-moving, changes over decades. Abstract, parts per million, global temperatures, not visceral. Delayed, causes now, consequences later. Diffuse affects everyone, so no one feels specifically targeted. Complex interactions between systems are hard to understand. We're neurologically built to ignore exactly this kind of threat. The prophecy says humanity faces catastrophe with eyes open, watching it approach, understanding intellectually, but not responding emotionally or behaviorally. We know, and yet we don't change. This is the great sleep, spiritual and psychological slumber, where we're conscious but not awake, aware but not responsive, informed but not transformed. Every wisdom tradition warns about this. The mass is asleep, living in illusion, going through motions while reality deteriorates. Buddha called it ignorance, not lack of information, but active denial of what we know. Plato's cave, prisoners seeing shadows, mistaking them for reality, refusing to turn around and see the truth. The Matrix, humans experiencing simulated reality, while their actual bodies are harvested. We're in the Matrix now. The simulation is normal life, jobs, consumption, entertainment, social media. The reality is climate breakdown, ecological collapse, civilizational decline. We know about the reality intellectually, but we live in the simulation emotionally. The prophecy says, most people stay in the simulation until it forcibly ejects them. They don't wake up. They get woken up by catastrophe that can't be ignored. But there's another possibility. The global awakening. This is the optimistic version. Humanity wakes up. Not everyone, but enough. Not gradually, but suddenly. A tipping point in consciousness where collective awareness shifts and we actually respond. Some prophecies describe this as spiritual awakening. Jaspartual, in Christ. Returning, Kalki arriving, Maitreya emerging. Others describe it as humans finally growing up, developing planetary consciousness, recognizing our unity. We're seeing hints. Youth climate movements, millions striking, protesting. Indigenous resurgence, traditional knowledge being recognized, degrowth economics, challenging growth paradigm, regenerative agriculture, rebuilding soil, sequestering carbon, renewable energy transition, accelerating faster than expected, nature rights movements, ecosystems being granted legal personhood. These are seeds of awakening, small now, but growing. The question is, too slow? The prophecy is ambiguous. Some versions say, awakening comes but too late to prevent catastrophe. We wake up mid-fall, finally understanding, but unable to stop momentum. Other versions say, awakening comes just in time. At the last moment, enough people wake up, enough systems change, and we narrowly avoid the worst outcomes. Which prophecy is true? Both, perhaps. We're in the branching point where either is possible. The great sleep continues for most people. Normal life, consumption, denial. Hoping someone else fixes it. Hoping technology saves us. Hoping it won't be that bad. But cracks are appearing. Extreme weather is making climate change visceral. Economic stress is making inequality undeniable. Political chaos is showing system failure clearly. Reality is intruding on the simulation. The prophecy says, when enough people can't deny reality anymore, rapid transformation becomes possible. Not through gradual reform, through sudden shift. Systems that seemed permanent suddenly change. Historical examples. The Berlin Wall standing for decades, then falling in months. Apartheid entrenched for generations, then dismantled in years. Slavery seemingly eternal, then abolished, legally. Social change doesn't happen linearly. It happens in punctuated equilibrium, long periods of stability, then rapid transformation. We might be approaching a punctuation point. The Great Sleep might be ending. The global awakening might be beginning, or we might stay asleep until catastrophe forces awakening under the worst possible circumstances. The prophecy says, we choose, not through one big decision, but through millions of small ones. Every person who wakes up, who changes, who acts, they tip the balance slightly toward awakening. Every person who stays asleep, who doesn't want to see, who prioritizes comfort over truth, they tip the balance toward catastrophe. It's cumulative, and we don't know where the tipping point is. The prophecy ends with uncertainty. They will sleep until they wake, or until they cannot sleep any longer. Voluntary awakening or forced awakening, evolution or collapse. We still have the choice. But the window is closing, the alarm is ringing, the house is starting to fill with smoke. Are we waking up? Every empire falls, every civilization ends. Archaeologists find ruins on every continent. Once great cities abandoned, sophisticated cultures collapsed, powerful empires vanished. The prophecy is simple. Ours will too. Not if, when. The question isn't whether industrial civilization collapses. It's how fast, how severe, and what emerges afterward. Collapse isn't one event. It's a process, sometimes taking centuries, Rome, sometimes decades, Soviet Union. Occasionally shockingly fast, Bronze Age collapse. Collapse means complex systems simplifying, usually through violence and deprivation. Centralized authority breaking down. Supply chains failing. Specialized knowledge being lost. Populations declining. Material conditions deteriorating. Not extinction. Simplification. We're entering early-stage collapse now. The signs are evident. Political legitimacy failing, trust in government at historic lows. Economic dysfunction. Wealth concentration unprecedented. Debt unsustainable. Infrastructure decay, roads crumbling, bridges failing, water systems leaking. Social atomization, community bonds dissolving, loneliness epidemic. Cognitive decline, declining attention spans, literacy rates dropping. Environmental overshoot, extraction exceeding regeneration. We're consuming 1.7 Earths annually. These aren't individual problems. They are symptoms of systemic collapse. The complex structures that defined modern civilization losing integrity, fragmenting, simplifying. The prophecy says this accelerates. Slowly at first, we're in the slow phase, then rapidly. Why does collapse happen? Joseph Tainter's research shows it's not moral failure or external invasion primarily. It's diminishing returns on complexity. Societies solve problems by adding complexity. More hierarchy, more specialization, more infrastructure. This works initially, but eventually the costs of complexity exceed the benefits. When this happens, collapse is rational. The complex system is abandoned because simpler systems work better. We're there. Modern civilization is incredibly complex, and the costs of maintaining that complexity are exceeding the benefits for more and more people. Collapse becomes attractive, not intentionally, but functionally. Systems that cost too much to maintain get abandoned. What does this look like? Probably not Hollywood apocalypse, sudden, complete, everyone dying. Probably more like a long, uneven, grim contraction. Governments unable to provide services they once did. Corporations unable to maintain supply chains. Communities returning to more local production and trade. Technology continuing but less universally accessible. Wealth disparities increasing. Wealthy enclaves with high tech, everyone else with much less. Population declining through combination of fewer births and higher deaths. Knowledge being lost as educational systems fail. This is already happening in parts of the world. Collapsed states, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, show what advanced collapse looks like. But even wealthy nations show early signs. American Rust Belt cities, British post-industrial towns, Greek austerity, Japanese demographic decline. The prophecy says this spreads, not uniformly. Some regions collapse faster, some slower. Some areas remain functional, while others descend into warlordism or subsistence living. A new medievalism, perhaps. Fragmented political authority, local strongmen, reduced trade, smaller-scale organization. But also opportunities. Collapse is creative destruction. Yes, much is lost. But what's lost is often what should have been lost. Systems that didn't work, structures that harmed more than helped. From collapse emerges possibility. New ways of organizing, new technologies appropriate to the conditions, new social arrangements. The prophecy of collapse isn't hopeless. It's realistic. Every civilization falls, and every fallen civilization makes space for what comes next. Medieval Europe collapsed from Roman complexity, and eventually built something different. Better in some ways, less slavery, worse in others, less sanitation initially. What comes after our collapse depends on what we preserve through it. Knowledge, seeds, tools, community structures, cultural wisdom, ecological practices. The prophecy says, some communities prepare. They see collapse coming. They build resilience. They create local systems that can function when global systems fail. These become seeds of whatever comes next. Others don't prepare. They cling to failing systems until it's too late. They suffer more during collapse and contribute less to what follows. The prophecy is neutral on this. It doesn't judge. It just says, both types exist during collapse. Which are you? One final element. Collapse timelines. If collapse is slow, centuries, most people adapt gradually. Each generation slightly worse off, but functional. If collapse is fast, decades, adaptation is violent and chaotic. Knowledge is lost. Technology regresses significantly. Current trends suggest moderate speed collapse. Not centuries, not immediate, but decades, possibly as soon as 2050, 2100 for major breakdowns in some regions. The prophecy says, we're in the beginning. How long until the fall? Hard to say. But probably within current lifetimes, we see major breakdowns. Prepare accordingly. Not with bunkers and guns, though some choose that. With community, knowledge, resilience, local systems that can function independently. Because the prophecy is clear. Complexity fails. What happens next depends on what we build in the rubble. This prophecy isn't about literal deities descending from clouds. It's about what happens when the dominant worldview collapses and older patterns of meaning resurface. Modernity made a promise. Science, reason, progress would replace religion, superstition, myth. We'd transcend our primitive past and live in an enlightened age of rationality. That promise is failing. The prophecy said it would. Not because science is wrong, but because humans need more than material explanations. We need meaning, connection to something larger, narrative frameworks that explain suffering and death, rituals that bind communities. Modernity provided none of this. It gave us technology, wealth for some, extended lifespans, but stripped away meaning. The world became disenchanted, mechanical, purposeless. Just atoms and void, sound and fury signifying nothing. For a while, progress itself served as ersatz religion, growth as salvation, technology as transcendence, rational utopia as heaven. But that religion is dying. Progress isn't delivering. Technology creates as many problems as it solves. The modern promise that we'd outgrow religion was wrong. We're watching the return of religious worldviews. Islamic resurgence. After decades of secularization, Islamic identity is reasserting, not just fundamentalism, but Islam as comprehensive worldview providing meaning that secular nationalism couldn't. Hindu nationalism, India returning to Hindu identity after post-colonial secularism. Christian revival, particularly Pentecostalism, exploding across the global south. Pagan revival in Europe and Americas. people rediscovering pre-Christian spiritual traditions. The prophecy says, when modernity fails to provide meaning, people return to older sources. Not because the old gods literally exist, but because the old stories, rituals, and worldviews provide what modernity can't: connection to the sacred, community identity, moral frameworks, ways of processing suffering. This isn't regression, it's adaptation. When the current paradigm fails, humans reach for what worked before. The old gods return not through supernatural intervention, but through psychological and social necessity. But there's danger here. The return of religious worldviews isn't automatically benign. Religion can provide meaning and community, but it can also provide tribalism, authoritarianism, violence against outsiders. History shows religious revivals can go either way, toward mystical renewal or toward fundamentalist oppression. The prophecy warns, when the old gods return, they bring both light and shadow. The same forces that provide meaning can demand conformity. The same traditions that offer wisdom can enforce ignorance. We're seeing both: spiritual seekers finding genuine connection through ancient practices, and religious extremists using tradition to justify violence. The return of the old gods also means the return of enchantment, the recognition that the world isn't just mechanical but meaningful. That reality has layers beyond what materialism acknowledges. This can be healthy, recognizing nature as sacred, developing ecological ethics, finding purpose beyond consumption. Or it can be dangerous: conspiracy thinking, rejection of science, superstition replacing critical thinking. The prophecy says, modernity's disenchantment was unsustainable. Humans need enchantment. We need to feel connected to something larger. The question is what form that enchantment takes. Indigenous traditions are also resurging, not just as ethnic identity, but as epistemology. Traditional ecological knowledge being recognized as valid, sometimes superior to Western scientific approaches. Animist worldviews, seeing nature as alive, interconnected, deserving respect, returning as alternatives to mechanistic materialism. This is the old gods returning in their most benign form, not as jealous tribal deities demanding sacrifice, but as recognition that the earth is alive, that we are embedded in it, that wisdom exists in traditions modernity dismissed as primitive. The prophecy ends ambiguously. The old gods return, yes. But which gods? The gods of wisdom, healing, and connection, or the gods of blood, tribalism, and domination? Both exist in every tradition. Which aspects we revive determines whether the return of the old gods is renewal or catastrophe. The ancient deities weren't simple. They were complex, containing multitudes, creation and destruction, wisdom and violence, healing and vengeance. When they return, they bring all of it. We choose which aspects we feed, which we starve. The prophecy says, modernity is dying. Something else is being born. It will have religious spiritual dimensions because humans are religious spiritual creatures. The return of the old gods is inevitable. Whether that return is liberation or oppression depends on how consciously we engage with it. The gods are coming back, not because they ever left, but because we're finally remembering they were always here. The earth is alive. The cosmos is meaningful. We're connected to something larger. Modernity tried to deny this. The denial is failing. What comes next is up to us. The old gods offer power. How we use that power determines everything. Here's the final truth the ancient prophets knew. Prophecy isn't only about prediction, it's about choice. Every prophecy we've examined contains the same core structure. If this continues, then that follows. Not fate, consequence. The Romans fell because they couldn't adapt. The Maya collapsed because they exhausted their environment. The Bronze Age civilizations crumbled because climate shifted and they couldn't respond. The Norse knew Ragnarok was coming because they'd seen the pattern before. But in every case, there was a window. A moment when different choices could have led to different outcomes. The prophecies we've inherited, all 30 of them, from every culture, every era, they're not predicting an unavoidable future. They're warning us about patterns that lead to predictable outcomes. And here's the final prophecy, the one that matters most. We're writing it right now. Not the ancient seers, not the gods, not fate, us. Every action taken today is inscribing tomorrow's prophecy. Every choice, personal, communal, national, global, is determining what future prophets will say about our age. Will they say, in the early 21st century, humanity faced catastrophic climate change, and they responded with courage, cooperation, and sacrifice. They transformed their civilizations. Many suffered, but they preserved what mattered most. Or will they say, in the early 21st century, humanity faced catastrophic climate change, and they did nothing. They knew what was coming. They had the technology to respond. But they were too divided, too short-sighted, too committed to comfort. The prophecy we're writing is still unfinished. The ending isn't determined. Yes, momentum exists. Systems in motion tend to stay in motion. The choices of previous generations constrain our options. We can't undo past emissions, can't resurrect extinct species, can't heal some wounds that have been inflicted. But neither is everything predetermined. There are still choice points, still moments where decisions matter. The ancient prophets knew this. That's why they prophesied, not to declare inevitability, but to create possibility for change. When the oracle warned Croesus about attacking Persia, she gave him a choice. When Jonah prophesied Nineveh's destruction, the city repented and was spared. The prophecy created the conditions for its own non-fulfillment. When climate scientists warn about tipping points, they're not declaring doom. They're creating space for response. Prophecy is intervention, not prediction. So here's what we do with the 30 prophecies we've examined. We recognize the patterns. Empire falls, so we don't build empires, we build resilient communities. Climate shifts, so we adapt, migrate, cooperate. Civilizations collapse, so we prepare, preserve knowledge, maintain skills. Migrations happen, so we develop compassion, open borders, recognize shared humanity. We acknowledge the warnings without succumbing to paralysis or denial. And we write a different prophecy, not through grand declarations, but through 10,000 small actions. The person who starts a garden writes prophecy. The community that shares resources writes prophecy. The activist who keeps organizing writes prophecy. The parent who teaches their children skills writes prophecy. Every act of courage, care, creativity, or connection writes the prophecy. The ancient seers saw patterns and warned us. Now, we become the seers. We see the patterns in our own time, and we choose whether to repeat them or break them. This is the power and burden of our moment. We're conscious. Previous civilizations collapsed largely unaware of the patterns they were repeating. We're different. We can see the precipice. The question is, can we see it clearly enough to step back? The prophecies say, usually no. Usually civilizations collapse because they can't or won't change course. But usually doesn't mean always. Sometimes humans surprise themselves. Sometimes the impossible happens. Maybe climate response follows that pattern. Maybe we're closer to a tipping point in consciousness than the pessimists believe. Or maybe not. Maybe we're the generation that had the knowledge and tools, but not the will. The prophecy is unwritten. We're writing it now. Every choice counts. Not because individual actions solve systemic problems. They don't. But because individual actions aggregate into cultural shifts, political movements, new possibilities. You can't control the whole prophecy. But you write your verse. What does your verse say? Does it say, I was comfortable while I could be, and I didn't want to see what was coming? Or does it say, I saw what was coming, and I did what I could, where I was with what I had? Neither verse guarantees survival, but the verse you write determines who you are during the transformation. It determines what you carry forward. It determines what seeds you plant for what might grow after. The ancient prophets are done. They warned us. They showed us the patterns. Now, it's our turn. Not to predict the future, to create it. Not to accept fate, to choose consequence. Not to wait for salvation, to become it, partially, imperfectly, but genuinely. The prophecy we write now won't be as poetic as Nostradamus, as mystical as the Maya, as epic as Norse Ragnarok. It will be written in food gardens and solar panels, in mutual aid networks and community resilience, in preserved knowledge and adapted skills, in compassion extended and courage shown. Small verses, quiet verses, but verses nonetheless. And maybe, just maybe, when the future arrives and looks back, they'll say, They saw what was coming, and enough of them tried, enough of them cared, enough of them acted. They didn't save everything, but they saved enough. They preserved enough. They loved enough. They wrote a prophecy of survival through the darkness, and here we are, reading it by the light of the dawn they made possible. That's the prophecy we could write. So, here we are, 30 prophecies, 30 warnings, 30 patterns that have repeated across millennia, across cultures, across the span of human civilization. Not because gods whispered in ears or seers gazed into mystical fires, though maybe they did, we can't know for certain, but because humans in their wisdom recognized patterns. They watched how things unfold, they saw what leads to what, and they warned those who would come after. We are those who came after. And now the prophecies aren't ancient history. They're not curiosities from dead civilizations. They're mirrors reflecting our world, our choices, our moment. The Romans fell, the Maya collapsed, the Bronze Age civilizations crumbled. The Norse knew winter would come. The Egyptians watched the floods. The Sumerians felt the heat. The Aztecs understood their sun was dying. The prophets warned again and again in language appropriate to their time and culture. And now we hear those warnings in our own language. Climate change, ecosystem collapse, political instability, social fragmentation, mass migration, the return of authoritarianism, the death of old certainties and the birth, painful, bloody, of whatever comes next. We are living through transformation. Not the end of the world, but the end of a world. The world we knew, the assumptions we held, the stability we took for granted. That world is ending. Something new is being born. The question that haunts me after examining these 30 prophecies isn't whether the warnings were true. They obviously were. The patterns are real. The consequences are manifesting.